Perhaps they first saw each other at the team gathering participating in cross-country running competitions in early autumn of 1995. Two high school girls from neighboring small towns competing in the 3-kilometer race. No one saw them exchange even 2 words or shake hands, as is customary among competition participants. And why should they? The girls hardly knew each other's names. Their characters and interests were so polarized. One of them, a cheerful, smiling blonde with translucent skin, captivated her classmates. The other, more graceful and petite, mesmerized with an entirely different beauty. Dark hair framed her face like a halo. Her eyes revealed a lively, inquisitive mind and determination. Catching her penetrating gaze made it impossible to look away. The girls had no reason to believe they had anything in common besides running. How could they know that their fates would be forever linked by their acquaintance with a young man, tall, sun-kissed, an aspiring cadet at a military academy? The two runners stood at the starting line, awaiting the shot from the starting pistol. It wouldn't be long before they would meet again. On the early morning of December 4th, 1995, a farmer traveling along a country road noticed the body of a teenage girl on the ground behind a barbed wire fence. Initially, it seemed to him that the poor girl had fallen victim to a car accident. Her face was almost unrecognizable. As later became known, she had been struck with something heavy, followed by 2 gunshots to the head. She was wearing shorts and a t-shirt with an inscription that quickly led the police to her school and eventually helped identify the girl. Adrienne Jones, a 16-year-old student from the small town of Mansfield, southeast of Fort Worth. The former farming settlement with a rodeo arena and charming antique shops along the main street, Mansfield was one of the last places near Dallas and Fort Worth where the serene atmosphere of a small town still lingered. In 1984, seeking a quiet and peaceful place to raise their children, Bill Jones and his wife Linda, along with their 3 kids, Adrienne and her younger brothers, moved to Mansfield. Bill was captivated by the modest neighborhood where houses stood neatly in rows, their green, lovely yards touching each other, while the voices of playing children echoed through the streets. Bill and Linda raised their children with strictness, especially Adrienne. However, she was never a rebel. She excelled academically and dedicated a lot of time to sports. After a knee injury during a football game, she joined the girls' cross-country team to get back in shape and proved herself to be such an excellent runner that she helped the team qualify for participation in regional competitions in Lubbock. The restaurant manager where she worked part-time was thrilled with the cheerful and lively employee, as were the customers, especially the boys. There was no shortage of guys interested in dating Adrienne, and it was precisely her sociable nature that made the investigation into her murder so challenging. Typically, when adults are killed, there are no more than 24 people who knew them closely. But a high school girl interacts with hundreds of other kids every day. Detectives quickly realized that Adrienne knew her killer or killers. There were no signs of struggle at the crime scene. Her hands or legs weren't tied. No one had broken into her home to abduct her. Subsequent autopsy revealed that violence wasn't the motive behind the crime. Her death seemed more like an execution, a result of someone's incredible rage, because it takes an extremely cold-blooded person to shoot a familiar girl in the face from half a meter away. Police compiled a list of individuals who might have had a grudge against Adrienne when Bill and Linda Jones reluctantly informed detectives that on the evening of their daughter's death, they allowed her to talk on the phone after the usual 10 p.m. curfew. Her boyfriend, Tracy Smith, was on a trip with his parents and managed to call her quite late. Bill allowed his daughter a few minutes to talk to Tracy. Linda overheard during the conversation that her daughter told Tracy to hold on because someone else was calling. Adrienne switched to call waiting and spoke with someone for a minute before ending the call with Tracy. When Linda asked her daughter who had called, she replied, "Oh, it's David from the cross-country team. He seemed upset about something." After talking with Tracy, Adrienne went to her room but didn't go to bed. Instead, she started ironing her school clothes. Linda recalls that her daughter seemed agitated. She instructed her to turn off the lights and go to sleep. The night passed quietly, except for the fact that shortly after midnight, Adrienne's younger brother heard the sound of a running engine near the house. When he looked out the window, he saw a pickup truck driving away from the house. The next morning, Adrienne wasn't in her room, but her parents thought she might have gone for a run. However, upon finding her sneakers, they grew concerned. Linda called her daughter's coach to inquire if there was a guy named David in the team. "Well, there's David Graham," the coach replied. Linda informed the coach that her daughter was missing, and that David might have called her in the evening. The coach was puzzled. She didn't even know that David and Adrienne were friends. When asked if he had called the girl in the evening, David expressed confusion, stating that he had no reason to do so. Investigators also spoke with David, but quickly ascertained that he had no connection to Adrienne's death, so they didn't even propose a polygraph test to him. Firstly, Adrienne's phone book didn't have David's name. Secondly, none of her friends mentioned him. Adrienne's close friends claimed that she shared her most intimate secrets with them, yet none mentioned anything about David. The prime suspect in Adrienne's case became a teenage girl from Mansfield, Tara, who lived in a trailer and had earned a bad reputation in town. A year earlier, she suspected her boyfriend of cheating on her with one of Adrienne's friends. According to police reports, the girl attacked her rival with a baseball bat and wounded her boyfriend with a gun. During the trial, Adrienne testified in favor of her friend, for which the accused vowed revenge against her. Some school students were convinced that this girl was responsible for the murder because she had already demonstrated her capacity for violent attacks with weapons. However, she had a solid alibi and passed a lie detector test. In turn, Bill and Linda suspected their daughter's boyfriend, Tracy Smith, because he didn't attempt to contact the family after Adrienne's murder. The girl's parents didn't know Tracy well. He was a tall football player attending school in the neighboring town of Venus. Apparently, he and Adrienne had met 2 months prior at a diner where she worked. Tracy also successfully passed a polygraph test. However, he provided the police with a new lead. He said that Adrienne told him that during their conversation that evening, it wasn't David who called her at home, but Brian. She mentioned that Brian seemed upset and wanted to meet her that night to talk. Investigators discovered that Brian McMillan worked nearby the restaurant where the girl worked part-time. He had a strong liking for her and would often visit to see her. However, he became so intrusive that when the girl saw him at the restaurant, she would hide behind the counter. Things took a darker turn when investigators found out that the 17-year-old boy was taking 4 types of medications to manage symptoms of depression. During police questioning, he initially claimed not to know Adrienne, then admitted knowing her, but couldn't recall if he spoke with her that night because he had been drinking heavily for the past 6 months. He mentioned feeling sad because all his friends had girlfriends and he felt like an outcast. The police built a compelling case. A young man unable to attract the attention of a beautiful girl finds a way to meet her at night, but loses control. Brian didn't deny the possibility of visiting Adrienne or taking her somewhere. He simply couldn't remember. On December 15, 1995, the police searched his house, seized his pickup truck, and arrested him, despite his father's claims that his son hadn't left the house that night. After spending Christmas and New Year in jail, the young man underwent a polygraph test, which he passed successfully. Following Brian's release, numerous rumors circulated about the case, but no new suspects emerged. During the summer of 1996, after nearly 300 interrogations, detectives were forced to acknowledge that they no longer had even a single worthwhile lead. Bill and Linda sank deeper into despair. Bill restrained himself from interrogating every teenager he encountered in town. Linda would sit in her car and drive to the place where Adrienne was found at night, hoping to encounter her killer. It seemed that the case would never be solved. Then, suddenly, on August 29, 1996, a lawyer from the military academy in Annapolis contacted the investigators inquiring about any unsolved teenage girl murder cases involving a girl named Adrienne. Naturally, the investigators responded affirmatively, asking for more details. It turned out that 2 female cadets at the academy had made a horrifying statement to senior officers related to a murder in Texas. Their roommate, Diane Zamora, confessed to them that her boyfriend would never cheat on her because they were bound by a murder. Investigators immediately flew to Annapolis, but Diane didn't confess to anything, stating that the story was merely an attempt to gain more respect among other cadets. However, the police didn't stop there. They flew to Colorado to speak with Diane's boyfriend at the Air Force Academy. The young man insisted he didn't know why she would fabricate such a blatant lie. They didn't believe him and continued questioning. David, yes, that same David Graham from Adrienne's cross-country running team at school. The David she allegedly spoke to on the phone on the night of the murder, according to Adrienne's mother. But Stacy said she spoke with Brian, so what was the truth? To find the answer, they needed to delve into the past of David and Diane. David had always intrigued his classmates. With his military-style haircut, straight posture, and excellent manners, he seemed like a person from another era. After witnessing an air show once in his life, David made up his mind to become a USAF pilot and never wavered from his dream. Many girls at school were interested in dating him, but few knew he was already taken. His girlfriend's name was Diane Zamora, attending school in the neighboring town. She was just as intelligent, athletic, and disciplined as David. Every spare moment was dedicated to studying because she dreamed of becoming an astronaut, requiring top grades. Like her boyfriend, she participated in cross-country running competitions. Anyone who saw David and Diane together knew they were destined for a bright future. Their relationship was far more serious than teenage infatuation. In September, about a month after they began dating, they informed Diane's parents that they were engaged. They planned to tie the knot on August 13, 2000, after completing their military education. The wedding was already envisioned. David in uniform, Diane in a white wedding dress, and at the ceremony's conclusion, they would pass under crossed swords held by their cadet friends. Their families were amazed by the seriousness of their relationship, which only deepened over time. David and Diane were so absorbed in each other's lives, almost obsessed. Diane even decided to attend the Air Force Academy alongside David, setting aside her own plans. However, when she missed the deadline for application, she enrolled at the U.S. Naval Academy, intending to transfer closer to her boyfriend later. Upon their acceptance into their respective academies, David and Diane became part of an elite group of American teenagers. Yet, to solidify their place in these prestigious institutions, they had to endure grueling summer training designed to rid them of civilian habits and instill military discipline. For the newcomers, these 6 weeks consisted of constant marching, running, push-ups, and strict adherence to orders. David excelled in basic training in Colorado Springs. According to Diane's letters to her family, she was also doing well in Annapolis. However, her squadron commander, Jay Guild, a likable cadet from Chicago, mentioned that Diane was physically falling behind the others because she always seemed emotionally detached. She kept reminiscing about David, missing him, but spoke about him strangely, as if she didn't trust him yet still wanted to be with him. David and Diane, once completely confident in their commitment to each other, seemed to have lost control of the situation. On one summer day, Jay asked Diane if David had ever cheated on her. She answered yes. When asked what she did about it, she said she asked David to kill another girl. Shocked, Jay listened to the story of how David killed a girl named Adrienne. Despite the strict moral principles of the academy, Jay didn't tell anyone about the conversation, for which he later paid the price in his dream of becoming an officer. He claimed he didn't want to believe her and thought the girl was just seeking attention, but at the end of August, Diane repeated her story to her 2 roommates. The girls talked, and one suddenly said that Diane and David were so close that it seemed they would even kill for each other. Diane confessed that they had killed before. Then, either out of guilt or pride, she told them the story about Adrienne. At first, the girls were skeptical about their roommate's story, but the next day, they informed a senior officer. He contacted the academy's attorney, who began calling police stations in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, inquiring about any unsolved murders of teenage girls. On August 29th, they contacted the police in Mansfield, immediately after which investigators flew to Annapolis. Although David tried to deny the accusations, the police managed to find out that his friend held a terrible secret. On the day of Adrienne's murder, David and Diane came to him at night in blood-stained clothes. Then the senior officers of the Air Force Academy told the young cadet that it was his duty to tell the whole truth, and the guy surrendered. He sat in front of the word processor and typed a confession spanning 5 pages. David wrote that on one weekend in November, he went to regional tryouts in Lubbock with other members of Mansfield High School's cross-country team. The school provided them with a large van for the trip. Naturally, Adrienne Jones, a member of the girls' team, also went to the tryouts. In many ways, Adrienne was the complete opposite of Diane. Despite her impressive academic and athletic achievements, she was an outgoing girl who knew how to charm any guy. However, nobody noticed anything between David and Adrienne during the tryouts. They didn't sit together, didn't talk, and as Adrienne's friends claimed, she intentionally kept her distance because she had high moral principles and would never draw attention from another girl's boyfriend. But according to David, something did happen when they returned to Mansfield. David gave the girl a ride home, but they didn't go straight to her house. They parked behind the elementary school where they spent some time together, enjoying each other's company, a brief but fatal adventure for this story. It was an impulsive mistake, and for a month after that night, David was plagued by guilt and shame. His perfect and pure relationship with Diane was tainted by one girl who stole our purity. Finally, he confessed everything to Diane. For at least an hour, she screamed so much that he was afraid for her. She screamed that she wished he never existed, that Adrienne never existed, then screamed that he should kill her. David hardly expected anything like that, but he agreed to fulfill her demand. After Diane's ultimatum, I hesitated long and hard to commit the crime. I was stupid, but I was in love, he wrote in his confession. David admitted that he called Adrienne on the night of December 4th, 1995, and told her he wanted to meet. He picked her up in a Mazda Protégé belonging to Diane's parents. Diane hid in the back. Parking the car on a remote road, the two attacked the girl. Diane hit her with David's dumbbell, but Adrienne managed to escape through the window and ran away. Panicking, David grabbed a 9mm Marikov pistol and ran after Adrienne. When it was all over, the two left. The only thing they said to each other was a confession of mutual love. Then Diane's thirst for revenge suddenly faded, and she said they shouldn't have done it. The young killers went to David's friend, who lived in the neighboring town of Burleson, and tapped on the window. In blood-stained clothes, they climbed into his room through the window. As David's friend recounted, David begged him not to ask questions. It was obvious that both David and Diane were extremely upset. They cleaned themselves in the bathroom, then lay down on the floor and just held each other tight. Initially, David's friend did not report the incident to the police, and David and Diane returned to their normal lives. In the spring, they learned that they had been accepted into educational institutions. David was admitted to the Air Force Academy, and Diane to the Naval Academy. On the attic of David's parents' house, the police found weapons and several dumbbells confirming David's confession. After that, it was Diane's turn to make a statement. Her version of events fully coincided with David's words. In her notebook, the police found an entry, December 4th, Adrienne, 1:38 a.m., and in the parents' car, the blood of the deceased girl. She was placed in a cell. She looked like an innocent girl in a sleeveless shirt and blue jeans. She continued to do push-ups and squats and asked her mother to bring her textbook so she could study. For the abduction and murder, David and Diane faced the possibility of the highest punishment. However, Adrienne's parents believed that the loss of one young life was sufficient and requested the prosecutors to insist on a life sentence. The young individuals were tried separately, and their lawyers promised to pin the blame on the other defendant. Although initially it seemed that David and Diane would never agree to this because they promised that nothing would ever come between them, Diane broke this promise initially. However, she failed to persuade the court that David committed the crime, and she had no involvement. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole only after 40 years. The trial against David concluded in a similar manner. However, during the hearing, a witness emerged whose testimony had the impact of a bombshell. The girl had attended the regional cross-country meet with Adrienne and David. After returning to Mansfield, supposedly when David dropped Adrienne off home and allegedly cheated on Diane, it was this witness who actually drove Adrienne home. Astonishingly, apart from a few of Adrienne's closest associates, no one ever questioned David's words regarding his connection with the girl. Although this statement didn't influence the verdict, it became entirely perplexing why David confessed to Diane about infidelity that never occurred. In interviews after the trial, he affirmed that there was nothing between him and Adrienne. He simply wanted to make his girlfriend jealous. If he retracted his words, she simply wouldn't have believed him. This story shook the entire country. The shocking truth left everyone astonished at what was happening with the best and brightest youth in the country. How did David and Diane convince each other that only death could erase the stain from their pristine teenage love? How could they think that infidelity was a far worse crime than murder? Various thoughts were expressed. David's lawyer believed that his client wrote the confession to protect Diane, and some investigators agreed, believing that Diane had an influence on David, compelling him to fulfill all her desires. Others believed that David, who introduced weapons and infidelity into Diane's life, once wholly dedicated to studying, made her his accomplice in a heinous crime, binding their fates forever. There was also the police's third theory that David, wanting to prove he didn't love Adrienne, fired one shot, while Diane, consumed by rage, fired the second. However, these are just speculations, so it remains only a matter of conjecture. Would they have become criminals if they had never met? The Bermuda Islands are a British territory in the western part of the Atlantic Ocean, located about 1,000 kilometers away from the coast of the USA. It is not a country in the traditional sense, nor is it a state with a developing economy. The Bermuda Islands can boast one of the highest per capita income levels in the world. The country takes pride in its safety for travelers, stunning beaches with pink sand and golf courses. Thanks to these attractions, it annually attracts 500,000 tourists, primarily from the USA. With a small population and low crime rates, local newspapers have always written about tourism and local entertainment, but only until the summer of 1996, when the world was shocked by the murder of a young tourist from Canada, and the subsequent injustice cast a shadow over the idyllic islands. In June 1996, 16-year-old Rebecca Middleton from Belleville, Canada, graduated from the 11th grade with top grades as she had worked hard for it. Rebecca, or Becky, was the youngest daughter of David and Cindy Middleton, who had separated when she was 13 years old. Fortunately, her parents had divorced amicably, and the children enjoyed spending time with both their father and mother. Being an active girl, Rebecca had a passion for water sports, loved sailing, and was involved in windsurfing. She loved spending time with friends, but always remembered the boundaries she shouldn't cross. In general, one could say that many parents dream of having such a daughter, cheerful, active, full of life, yet responsible. This is precisely why David and Cindy reluctantly allowed Rebecca to fly to the Bermuda Islands with her best friend, Jasmine Means. Jasmine's father, Rick Means, lived on the main island, and the girls were supposed to stay at his house and be under his care throughout the vacation. Nevertheless, it took a year of negotiations and communication between the parents over the phone before Cindy and David were convinced that they could let their daughter go so far. However, Becky's parents had no significant reasons to worry. Bermuda had traditionally been considered the safest place for a vacation. On June 20th, 1996, Becky and Jasmine set off for a 6-week vacation. It was a dream journey, and for the first 2 weeks, the girls thoroughly enjoyed it. How could it be otherwise? Picturesque islands surrounded by crystal-clear ocean waters that invited exploration. And then there were endless opportunities to sunbathe on the beach with its astonishing pink sand. On June 27th, Becky celebrated her 17th birthday far from her family. However, Jasmine, Rick, and his wife Lynn ordered a beautiful cake and made every effort to ensure that the celebration would be unforgettable for the guests. During their vacation, the girls met 3 young men from the UK, also visiting for the summer: Russell McCann, Ben Turtle, and Jonathan Cassidy, whose father was a police officer who had been transferred to the island from Britain. On July 2, 1996, it was Russell's turn to celebrate his birthday. The young group had planned to arrive by boat, but the weather interfered with their plans, and due to the rain, they had to abandon that idea. At the last moment, they decided to go to a pub. To celebrate Russell's birthday, the young people chose the oldest and most respected pub, which also happened to be a seafood restaurant. On the Bermuda Islands, alcoholic beverages could be ordered starting from the age of 18. Nevertheless, the girls had a few glasses of beer and cocktails. After leaving the pub, the young people decided to take a walk to their friend's house in the town of St. George's to the east of the main island. They spent some time at their friend's house, but when it was time to return home, the girls were slightly delayed, and they missed the time when they should have called Rick to pick them up. Moreover, Becky and Jasmine had had a few drinks and were worried that Rick would be upset. That's why, at 1:08, the girls called a taxi and went to wait for it on the street. When the taxi didn't show up by 1:45, the girls returned to their friend's house and called the taxi service again. The operator told them that the taxi had come, but the driver hadn't seen them, so he had left. After waiting on the street for another half hour, Jasmine and Becky called again at 2:16 in the morning. Jonathan Cassidy waited with them for a while, but decided to go inside the house and go to sleep. He left them waiting for the taxi, being confident that the taxi would arrive soon. Perhaps he thought they could return to the house and knock. The other guys were already asleep. By this time, dawn was approaching, and the girls were getting nervous. They were sure that Rick would scold them when they got home. In reality, Rick wasn't too angry or extremely concerned. After all, it was not unusual for teenagers to lose track of time while celebrating a birthday, and it was hard for him to imagine that anything could happen in a place as safe as Bermuda. It never crossed his mind that something might go wrong. While Jasmine and Rebecca were standing on the street, the lights in their friend's house went out, signaling that everyone had gone to sleep and it would be inconvenient to knock on their door again. At this moment, a local acquaintance of theirs, 21-year-old Dean Lattimore, arrived on a motorcycle. He asked them if they needed a taxi, to which the girls replied that they had already called one and were waiting for it to arrive. They had only talked for about 2 minutes when another motorcycle approached from the opposite direction, carrying 2 local guys. They seemed to recognize Dean and gave him a nod of greeting. The young men asked the girls what they were doing on the street at that time in a small town where they obviously weren't locals. The motorcycle driver showed a clear interest in Rebecca and complimented her on the necklace that Jasmine had given her. The guys assured the girls that the taxi wouldn't come, and they offered to give them a ride. Jasmine reasoned that they didn't have helmets, and they didn't want any trouble because of it. The guys replied that they had 1 spare helmet. Another one was found with Dean. Honestly, Rebecca and Jasmine didn't want to get on the motorcycle with unfamiliar guys, but it was clear they had no better option. Mobile phones weren't common at the time. There were no nearby payphones, and the buses wouldn't start running for several hours, and the taxi still hadn't arrived. What choice did they have? Of course, they could have woken up their friends and called Jasmine's dad, but the girls dismissed that idea. Since Jasmine was slightly bigger in build than Rebecca, she sat on Dean's motorcycle, and Rebecca sat on the other motorcycle between the 2 guys. All of them set off. The guy's motorcycle with Rebecca on it was in front, and Dean and Jasmine followed behind. Jasmine had asked Dean not to rush, and he carefully drove her. As a result, the guys on the other motorcycle quickly distanced themselves. At the bridge, Dean chose a shorter route, and around 2:30 in the morning, Jasmine was already home. She was surprised that her friends were not there yet, as Rebecca should have arrived before her. The spare key was in its place by the door, and the door to the house was locked. With growing anxiety, Jasmine waited for Rebecca. Finally, unable to wait any longer, she went to her dad and said that she had lost Rebecca. Rick couldn't understand how the girls could have separated, but he got in the car, and they began to look for Rebecca. Jasmine was too scared to admit to her dad that her friend had gotten on the motorcycle with 2 completely unfamiliar guys. She only said that she had last seen her on the bridge. While Jasmine and her father were looking for Rebecca near the bridge where Jasmine had last seen her, about 13 kilometers away, 4 friends were driving along Ferry Reach Road after a pleasant evening. Dana Rollins, a club DJ, was behind the wheel. Suddenly, the car's headlights caught sight of a figure lying in the darkness on the road. Dana got out of the car and cautiously approached. He saw that it was a young girl, a teenager. She was partially undressed, lying with her back to the car, curled up in a ball. The girl was covered in blood, and it appeared that she had been attacked before she managed to crawl to the road. She couldn't speak due to a deep wound on her throat, but attempted to say something. Dana tried to stop the bleeding and encouraged the girl to hold on and save her energy for help. At the same time, his friends drove to the nearest payphone to call for an ambulance, while Jasmine and her father were searching for Rebecca at the bridge, where Jasmine last saw her. An ambulance sped past them. Jasmine sensed that the ambulance was going to pick up Rebecca and told her father so. However, Rick cut his daughter off, not allowing her to even think that something bad could have happened. The ambulance arrived fairly quickly, but was still late. The medics couldn't do anything to help Rebecca. When Rick and Jasmine returned home, the sun had risen. Rick immediately called the police to report Rebecca's disappearance. The responding officer informed him that they would have to wait for 24 hours before they could file a missing person report. Rick argued with the officer, trying to convince him that Rebecca could not have simply gone somewhere when she suddenly received word that he was placed on hold. When the officer returned to the call, he asked Rick to come to Ferry Reach Road. Rick inquired if they had found Becky, but the only response he received was, "Go to the bridge." In frustration, Rick hung up the phone, and he and his daughter drove to the indicated location. Even from a distance, they spotted numerous police cars and officers, clearly working at a crime scene. Rick got out of the car and asked his daughter to wait for him. He didn't want her to see what he feared he would find beyond the police barricade. Approaching the scene, Rick noticed a body bag. Investigators unzipped the bag and asked him if he could identify the person inside. Rick admitted that Rebecca had been so severely injured and had lost so much blood that he had to look a second time before he could tell the investigators that it was her. He attempted to embrace her, but the police officers pulled him away. Hysterics overcame him, and he cried out in pain and despair, striking the police van in disbelief. Jasmine, who was still sitting in the car, heard her father's screams and realized that Rebecca was no more. On the way back home, both father and daughter were in a deeply sorrowful state. Rick didn't know how to tell Rebecca's parents that their daughter was dead, not just dead, but brutally murdered. How could he tell them that he hadn't protected their daughter, whom he had promised to take care of? Having given Rick the opportunity to inform Rebecca's family, the investigators wanted to speak with him and his daughter. It's difficult to imagine the horror that overcame Rick when Jasmine informed the police that Rebecca had gotten on a motorcycle with two strangers. This was the first time he had heard of it. Jasmine didn't know their names, only that they were two young men on a motorcycle, a description that could fit many local men. She knew Dean, the one who had driven her home, but not the other two. The brutal murder of a young Canadian tourist on Bermuda, a place heavily dependent on tourism, could have had a significant impact on the country's economy. Therefore, there would have been immense pressure on the investigators to solve the case as quickly as possible. However, the inexperience of many of the investigators, as well as potential breaches of standard police procedures, complicated the collection of evidence. Nevertheless, they managed to gather evidence at the crime scene. Rebecca's bustier had been cut from her shoulders, and her skirt was torn in the front. The necklace that had caught the attention of the men was nowhere to be found, possibly taken by the perpetrators as a souvenir. Typically, in cases of suspicious deaths in Bermuda, an autopsy is conducted by an outside expert. However, in this case, the autopsy was performed by a local hospital pathologist, who openly acknowledged a potential lack of skills and experience for such work. Still, the authorities pushed for haste, and he concluded that Rebecca had been subjected to brutal violence before her death, suffering deep wounds that affected vital organs, including the neck wound, which led to her demise due to shock and severe bleeding. 4 men who found Rebecca's body were questioned and quickly ruled out as suspects. The police promised Rebecca's parents to find her killer as soon as possible and devoted all their efforts to the search, investigating local young men with legal troubles. After that, they invited Dean for identification, but even here, they deviated from the standard police procedure. There was no two-way mirror or opaque barrier between Dean and the suspects, nothing that would allow the witness's identity to remain hidden. What was even more horrifying was that Dean recognized one of the guys who had driven Becky, but he knew how dangerous and vengeful that person was. He was afraid for his family, his son, and ultimately for his own life, so he claimed that the guys were wearing helmets and he didn't see their faces. Following the unsuccessful identification, the police, in a hurry to apprehend the culprits, offered a $10,000 reward for any information leading to the arrest of the criminals. They continued to interrogate potential suspects when a breakthrough occurred on July 9th, 6 days after the crime. Dean decided that what had happened was too terrible to let the killers escape punishment, and, despite his fear, he provided the investigators with the names of the guys who had approached the girls on a motorcycle that evening. They were 21-year-old Jamaican native Kirk Mundy and 17-year-old Justice Smith. Kirk had just been released from prison on bail awaiting trial for a bank robbery case. Justice Smith came from a decent family but had dropped out of school and was getting into trouble after associating with Kirk. The guys were arrested and charged with Rebecca's murder. In Bermuda, 17-year-old Justice could be tried as an adult, so they faced the highest possible punishment if convicted. Shortly after that, another witness contacted the police. He explained that he and a friend had a breakdown near the crime scene. While they were waiting for assistance, Justice and Kirk pulled over to chat with them. The witness stated that Kirk appeared unusually disheveled, and there was blood on his shirt. Nevertheless, Kirk and Justice continued to deny any involvement and insisted that they were nowhere near that road. Justice claimed they were at a nightclub, while Kirk stated that he was at home with his girlfriend, who was expecting a child. The police collected DNA samples from the two and sent them to a laboratory in Canada for testing. While awaiting the test results, another witness emerged, having seen the two guys on the motorcycle at 3:20 in the morning. He noticed that a white piece of fabric covered the motorcycle's registration number. Interestingly, the white vest that Rebecca was wearing that evening was never found. Kirk Mundy knew that he was facing a serious charge for murder, Understanding that he was linked to the crime scene and that his DNA was being analyzed, he requested a meeting with a lawyer. The lawyer directly told him that if his DNA matched the semen found on the girl, his alibi of being at home would be completely disproven. In response, Kirk decided to provide a statement to the prosecutor, admitting that he had assaulted the girl and that Eustace had killed her, making him an involuntary accomplice to the crime. Kirk revealed that he had thrown the knife, used in the murder, into the water from a bridge. The prosecutor's office, under immense pressure to solve the case, quickly struck a deal with Kirk before waiting for the DNA test results in exchange for his testimony against Eustace. In court, Kirk apologized before being sentenced to 5 years in prison for his involvement in the crime. The remarkably lenient sentence deeply upset Rebecca's parents, but their nightmare was far from over. Just 2 days after this sentence, the results of the DNA comparison arrived. Justice Smith's DNA was not found at the crime scene. Only Kirk Mundy's DNA was present. Kirk had humiliated the girl and at the very least had participated in her murder. Kirk had outwitted the prosecutor, the police, and probably his own lawyer, as they all believed him. The prosecutor confronted Kirk, demanding an explanation for how his DNA ended up on the girl. Kirk claimed that as they were riding on the motorcycle, Rebecca whispered that she was willing to be intimate with him. After he fulfilled her wish, he claimed he walked to the water to wash up when he suddenly heard Rebecca scream, "No!" He rushed back, and it appeared as though Eustace was striking her in the face. However, a few seconds later, he noticed that she was bleeding from her throat. They quickly fled on the motorcycle. The prosecutor did not believe a word of Kirk's story and attempted to accuse him of intentionally murdering Rebecca, but it was too late. By law, a person cannot be tried twice for the same crime. Kirk slipped through the prosecutor's fingers. The prosecutors decided to at least seek justice in the case against Justice Smith. There was no sign of his semen on Rebecca, possibly because he used a condom. 2 condom wrappers were found near the crime scene, but such evidence wouldn't be admissible in court. Therefore, the most crucial piece of evidence became the knife, approximately 10 centimeters long with a broad blade, that the culprits had discarded from the bridge. The prosecution called on renowned American pathologist Michael Baden to examine it, who also re-examined the autopsy results. He explained that when a serrated knife makes contact with skin, it leaves markings as unique as fingerprints. The wounds on Rebecca's body matched the knife found under the bridge. In Justice's home, a set of relatively rare knives from the same manufacturer as the murder weapon was discovered, missing 1 knife. The evidence continued to mount, but proving anything was difficult because the initial autopsy had been conducted with errors. For instance, the body had been washed before the examination was completed. Additionally, no skin samples from the attacker's nails were taken from Rebecca. These samples could have revealed who she had struggled with before her death: Kirk, Justice, or both. However, based on his experience, the pathologist concluded that the person responsible for her death was not acting alone. The pathologist's analysis indicated that before Rebecca's murder, she had suffered shallow but highly distressing and emotionally intimidating wounds, which he referred to as Jamaican torture. The distinct edges of these wounds and the absence of cuts on the girl's hands suggested that one assailant held her head and arms behind her, while the other used the serrated knife to scratch and cut her forehead. She was on her knees at the time, and her tormentor loomed over her. The pathologist believed that these torturous wounds were meant to coerce the girl into doing things during the attack that she had initially resisted. After the attacker obtained what he wanted, he slashed her throat with the knife. Rebecca died within minutes, and due to her internal injuries, she wouldn't have been able to make it to the road by herself. Again, 2 people had to carry her. The bruises on her wrists and smudges on her boots pointed clearly to 2 individuals. After this ordeal, the perpetrators left her to die from blood loss. In November 1998, the trial of Justice Smith began, and his parents hired a lawyer from Britain to defend their son. Suddenly, a week before the trial, the lead prosecutor left the Bermuda Islands, and his replacement had little time to prepare for the trial. Complicating matters, all the evidence against Eustace was circumstantial. Nevertheless, the evidence appeared to be quite reliable. The last time Rebecca was seen, Kirk and Justice were taking her on a motorcycle, and they were identified by Dean. Witnesses connected the guys to the crime scene. The pathologist clearly stated that 2 individuals were involved in the crime. The murder weapon matched a set of knives in Eustace's kitchen. Shouldn't that have been enough? After the prosecution finished presenting the case, Eustace's lawyer didn't call a single witness. He simply argued that there was no semen, hair, fiber, or blood that could link Justus to the murder or violence, and thus the case against him should be dismissed, and the jury should be discharged. Nobody expected what would happen next. Out of the blue, the news broke that the judge had agreed with the defense's arguments and was discharging the jury. Justice Smith walked out of the courtroom as a free man. Rebecca's parents were in shock. Cindy rushed out of the courtroom and David sat there, unable to move. Many in the courtroom were brought to tears by the injustice. Naturally, the prosecutor filed an appeal, arguing that the judge had not considered the circumstantial evidence, which was substantial. The Bermuda Court of Appeal ordered a new trial for Justus, but this decision was challenged in the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council of the United Kingdom, acting as the country's highest court. They ruled that Justus could not be tried a second time for the same offense. Their decision was final, putting an end to any further appeals. In 2002, Justus Smith attacked 2 women with a knife, injuring one of them. He was sentenced to 10 months in prison, but the judge released him, considering the time he had already spent in custody. Kirk Mundy served 20 years in prison for a robbery he was initially charged with before Rebecca's murder and for weapons possession. Upon his release, he was deported to Jamaica. Since nobody faced punishment for Rebecca's murder, the nightmare for her family continued. They deserved more. Every day, her family would come to the courthouse, hoping and waiting for justice. In the following years, Rebecca's family desperately sought justice for their daughter. They made several attempts to reopen the case, but in 2008, David announced that he could no longer financially support the battle against Bermuda's legal system. Ironically, 10 years after the murder, the government of the island compensated the Middleton family for the pain and suffering they endured, cutting a check for $2,840. Several years before the John Benet Ramsey case, America was trying to solve the mystery of the disappearance of 7-year-old Jacqueline Dovalibi. Was she abducted by a stranger who entered her home under the cover of night? Or did she become a victim within her own family? The police were convinced that the culprits were always in plain sight, whereas no one who knew the family doubted their complete innocence. Midlothian, located in the state of Illinois, USA, is a small town where everyone knows each other. It is situated approximately 30 minutes south of the bustling streets of Chicago and is considered a quiet suburb where there is always a sense of being in a familiar place. However, in 1988, the town changed forever when 7-year-old Jacqueline Dovalibi disappeared from her own bedroom in the middle of the night. Jacqueline lived in a cozy, ranch-style home with her parents, David and Cynthia, and her 4-year-old brother, Davy. The family resided in a beautiful location surrounded by several nature preserves, all within walking distance from their home. Jacqueline's biological father, Jimmy Guess, had no involvement in her life after a bitter divorce from Cynthia shortly after their daughter was born. David Dovalibi adopted Jacqueline when he married Cynthia 5 years ago when Jacqueline was 2 years old, and he was the only father she knew. Cynthia worked as a dietitian at the local hospital, and David was a carpenter who had been promoted to a foreman. David and Jacqueline had an instant connection, often going fishing and bowling together. According to one neighbor whose daughter was friends with Jacqueline, she was a happy little girl who never showed any signs of sadness or anger. According to all accounts, the Dovalibis were a typical, close-knit suburban family. On the evening of September 10, 1988, Cynthia took Jacqueline and Davy to a nearby KFC Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant, while David met up with his friends and went bowling. When all family members returned home, they watched television, and Jacqueline, wearing her favorite purple and white pajamas, kissed Cynthia and David goodnight. What exactly happened in the house that night remains unclear, but the next morning, the little brunette with brown eyes was no longer there. David and his son woke up earlier than the other family members on the next morning, and around 7:45, David noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. At first, he thought that his mother, who lived with the family, had left it open and didn't worry much about it. He prepared breakfast for Davy and turned on the television. A little later, Cynthia woke up and went to wake up their daughter but couldn't find Jacqueline in her bedroom. The parents called Jacqueline's friends, thinking that she might have gone outside to play. While they searched for the child inside the house and in the neighborhood, Cynthia noticed that the basement window was broken and wide open. David immediately called the police and reported his daughter's disappearance. After investigators arrived at the house, Cynthia and David explained that none of them had heard anything unusual during the night, and they had all been sound asleep. Nothing was missing from the house except Jacqueline's blanket, which matched the colors of her pajamas. Furthermore, there were no signs of a struggle. Investigators needed to determine whether someone had broken into the house and taken Jacqueline, or if she had left the house herself, only to be taken by someone else. Although there were no phone calls or ransom notes, the FBI agents took over the investigation, presuming that they were dealing with a kidnapping rather than a runaway case. Soon, the news of a possible abduction spread throughout the town. The suburb mainly consisted of families with young children, and the possibility that someone had broken into a family's home and abducted their little girl in the middle of the night while everyone was asleep was a horrifying revelation. Considering that there were no signs of a struggle, investigators began to wonder if the girl might have left with someone she knew. If the intruder had entered the house through the broken basement window, they needed to be familiar with the layout of the house to enter the girl's room without waking the other family members, investigators concluded. We are looking at it with an open mind as a potential abduction, but also as an abduction with someone known to the family, said Police Captain John Bitton. This statement led Cynthia to recall an unsettling incident that occurred several years earlier. After a bitter custody battle during which her former partner, Jimmy Guest, did everything in his power to keep their daughter with him, he had broken into their home and attempted to take their daughter. Therefore, Cynthia suspected his involvement in Jacqueline's disappearance because she knew he was capable of such actions. Jacqueline's grandmother, Anne Dovalibi, admits that she wasn't initially worried about her granddaughter's safety because she believed that Jacqueline had been taken by her biological father, and she was confident they would quickly get her back. However, she couldn't have known that Jimmy had been in prison in Florida for the previous 4 months during Jacqueline's disappearance and was soon ruled out as a suspect. Suspicion also fell on Jacqueline's uncle, Timothy Guest, who lived nearby and suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. However, he had an alibi. It was at this point that Cynthia began to worry that something bad had happened to her daughter. The parents of the girl, Cynthia and David, were questioned multiple times in the following days. They didn't hide anything. They explained that Jacqueline had gone to bed at 10 p.m., and when Cynthia went to check on her at 11 p.m., she was sound asleep. The police became increasingly skeptical of the parents' story. It was difficult for them to believe that a person unfamiliar with the layout of the house could have crawled through the basement window without disturbing the towel dryer right beneath the window. Then, they would have had to walk down the hallway to the girl's room and take her away without waking any of the other family members. The only sign that a stranger had been in the house was the broken window. No fingerprints or signs of a struggle were found. Indeed, when it comes to fingerprints and other evidence, it's important to note that the police themselves made a series of mistakes that could have influenced their conclusions. They never secured the girl's room to prevent anyone from entering it, and they didn't thoroughly search the house. A forensic expert took photographs, but he didn't even bother to take close-up pictures of the broken window. He checked the window and the front door for fingerprints, but not the back door. What was even more astonishing was that the police allowed friends of the family to clean up their house and even sweep away the glass from the broken window. The police just stood by and watched as they cleaned up, destroying any evidence that the kidnapper might have left behind. Immediately after the girl's disappearance, Jacqueline's parents were asked to take a polygraph test. Cynthia was too distraught for such a test. Friends recall that she was in a terrible state, constantly feeling nauseous. David underwent the polygraph test, which he passed. But in the minds of the police, everything seemed to point to the parents. The number of potential suspects sharply narrowed after one of the forensic experts stated that, in his opinion, the basement window had been broken from the inside. On September 14th, 5 days after the girl's disappearance, the parents attempted to take a polygraph test again. Cynthia's results were inconclusive due to her emotional state. David's results were also inconclusive, and the polygraph examiner accused him of not cooperating with the investigation. David in turn claimed that the polygraph examiner instructed him to answer yes to all questions, including the question, "Did you kill your daughter?" to which David refused to answer yes. Afterward, David was taken into an interrogation room and was not released for 5 hours. Later that evening, Michael Chapman pulled into the parking lot of the Islander Apartments on 1912 Canal Street in Blue Island, a town located about 5 kilometers from the girl's home. When Chapman exited his car, he noticed an unpleasant odor in the fresh autumn air. He spotted something wrapped up in the grass, which he described as a wrapped-up object. As he approached, he saw a head and a hand, and he immediately ran inside to call the police. Jacqueline's body was discovered, and she was still bound with a 2-meter rope, which was considered evidence of the crime. Her soiled underwear was found about 60 centimeters from her body. As for the police, they continued to question Jacqueline's father for about 1.5 hours without informing him that his daughter had been found. They tried to convince him to confess to the crime. When Officer Kevin Shaughnessy finally told him about Jacqueline's discovery, David didn't believe him, thinking it was another police trick to make him confess. This is likely why he responded with the phrase, "I guess you think I should cry now?" However, Officer Shaughnessy interpreted these words differently, and they convinced him not to pursue other suspects. In any case, there was no evidence against David, and he was released to go home, where he found his distraught wife and realized that his daughter was truly gone. By morning, with the help of dental records, the body was officially identified as Jacqueline DeWallaby. Initially, based solely on the appearance of the body, there was speculation that she had been struck on the head, but the Cook County coroner, Dr. Robert Stein, stated that the condition of the body was the result of rapid decomposition due to the unusually warm September weather. Dr. Stein could not determine with certainty whether the girl had been sexually assaulted or not due to the state of decomposition. Although the exact time of death couldn't be determined either, Robert Stein concluded that she had been dead for several days, and the terrible crime was most likely committed early Saturday morning, right after her disappearance. After the body was identified, and given that they had been individually questioned for hours before Jacqueline was found, both Cynthia and David hired lawyers who advised them to invoke their Fifth Amendment rights and not answer any more questions from investigators. They had already told the police everything they knew, provided blood and urine samples, and gave permission for investigators to examine any family medical records that might be relevant. They also allowed investigators access to their home for all 5 days that Jacqueline was missing. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution allows citizens to refuse to answer any questions that may incriminate them. The DeWallabys had every right to invoke the Fifth Amendment. However, with no other suspects, law enforcement focused their attention on Cynthia and David as the primary suspects and claimed that it was suspicious that they were not cooperating with investigators. Police rushed to accuse the family of refusing to cooperate with the investigation. Prosecutor Patrick O'Brien explained, "Even if you are being looked at as a suspect, and you know deep down inside that you didn't do this, and it's unfair, the idea of not cooperating with the police that are investigating the murder of your daughter seems overly concerned about your personal interests." On the day after the funeral, a team of 20 police officers executed search warrants at the DeWallaby home. They emerged from the house with several large bags containing items they wanted to examine in the laboratory. Additionally, they confiscated the family's blue Chevrolet Malibu. Months passed, but there were no updates or new information about the case. However, the police made a statement indicating that the family members had not been excluded as suspects. Cynthia's lawyer, Lawrence Hyman, criticized the police investigation, calling it a blatant violation of the law. While Cynthia and David continued to avoid communicating with the media, they had a multitude of supporters. Neighbors stood by the family, telling journalists that the DeWallabys were a loving and caring family, and they had never heard either of the parents raise their voice at Jacqueline or Davy. David's boss, Ross Patterson, recalled, "The only time David took a day off work was when he needed to get documents for Jacqueline's adoption." However, this did not convince the investigators. Adhering to the theory that Cynthia and David could be involved in the crime, they returned to the location where the body was found and began showing photos of Cynthia, David, and their car to residents of the Islander apartments, hoping to find any witnesses who might have seen them in the area. On November 22nd, Cynthia and David were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Their son Davy was placed under the care of the Department of Family and Children's Services. It became known that a tenant of the apartment complex where the body was found had told investigators that he had seen David in a blue Chevy Malibu in the parking lot. A witness, a 35-year-old city transportation worker named Everett Mann, said that around 2 a.m. on September 10th, he was pulling into the parking lot, and his headlights illuminated a blue Chevy with a driver he claimed was David DeWallaby. During Cynthia and David's arrest, they were deliberately paraded in front of the media so that as many photos as possible could be taken, seemingly to convey the message, "Look, we've done our job." Detectives boasted about having a wealth of evidence against David and Cynthia, including 2 witnesses. However, it remained unclear why loving parents would act this way towards their daughter. Were there enough pieces of evidence? Or were the investigators rushing to take the case to court for some reason? Perhaps the answer to this question lies in the fact that on the same day as the parents' arrest, a major news story emerged. Richard M. Daley, the state's chief prosecutor whose office was handling the case, announced his candidacy for mayor of Chicago. Critics accused him of using a high-profile crime in his political game. But despite the criticism, Daley became the mayor of Chicago, and the case was handed over to the court. It is widely known that eyewitness testimonies are highly unreliable. Nevertheless, the witness statements suggesting that David was near the crime scene were enough to charge him and his wife with first-degree murder. Blue Island Police Chief Paul Greaves referred to these witness testimonies as excellent evidence that allowed them to rule out other leads. The police never disclosed what those other leads were, but relying solely on witness testimony to exclude all other possibilities seemed somewhat prejudicial, especially considering that Cynthia was not linked to the crime scene. Both spouses were denied bail, and it was revealed that Cynthia was in the early stages of pregnancy. In the search for new evidence, the police decided to focus on the couple's 5-year-old son, Davy, who was examined by a doctor. Supposedly, the doctor found traces on his body that could have resulted from a belt, some of which were old while others were recent. The police suspected that Cynthia and David had abused Davy at home, suggesting it could be a motive for the crime. Patrick Murphy, Davy's state-appointed guardian, said that the police and prosecutors continuously questioned the child for days. He added that after speaking with Davy and reviewing his medical records, he couldn't understand how they arrived at such a conclusion because he couldn't find anything that indicated violence against the child. He also mentioned that Davy constantly pleaded to see his parents, and he missed them greatly. In mid-December, Cynthia and David were released on bail, but Davy was not allowed to return home with his parents. He was placed in the custody of David's sister Rose and her husband John. Davy was only allowed to see his parents during supervised visits. In April 1990, the court proceedings began. It became clear early on that the evidence gathered by law enforcement was not as compelling as initially reported. The prosecutors didn't even have a clear motive for the crime, but fortunately for them, they were not legally obligated to provide one. Their main argument was straightforward. There were no outsiders in the house, so the Dovalibys must be guilty. The defense argued that due to the poor police work, it was impossible to determine how the intruder had entered the house and what had transpired inside during that night. The idea that the intruder needed to know the layout of the house to find Jacqueline's bedroom seemed far-fetched. The family lived in a typical ranch-style house. Many such houses are built with a similar layout. Anyone who had ever been inside a similar house would likely know the layout. The prosecutors also tried to argue that the intruder had to navigate through a window without disturbing objects below, such as a vanity, a TV stand, and a towel rack. To demonstrate that this was possible, David filmed a video showing how a neighbor climbed through the basement window, propped his leg on the wall, and didn't disturb any objects below. Furthermore, it turned out that the prosecution had only one witness, not 2. Everett Mann, the key prosecution witness, admitted during the trial that he had identified David solely by his prominent nose. He was about 70 meters away from the man in the parking lot and only remembered his distinctive nose, as it was dark and the lighting was quite dim. Moreover, during the photo identification, Everett was shown a frontal picture of David, while he had only seen the person in profile. Additionally, David's photo was much larger than the 4 photos of other men. Everett admitted that the person he saw that night could have been African American or Caucasian, or even a man or a woman, and all he saw was a silhouette that only looked male. In a night without moonlight, 3 weeks into the trial, the jury members were taken to the same parking lot where Everett had supposedly seen David. They stood in the same spot under similar conditions as Everett. They could hardly see anything. In reality, they couldn't even notice a nearby garbage can, which was said to be near where the car was parked. Several neighbors of the Dovalibys also contradicted the witness's account regarding the car. The defense lawyers built their case around the fact that a remarkably similar crime occurred in the same neighborhood about a year after Jacqueline's abduction. On September 2, 1989, Perry Hernandez broke into a home in Blue Island and kidnapped a 6-year-old girl while her family slept. He entered by breaking a window and made his way inside without waking anyone. The man took the girl to a railroad bridge near the Calumet River, tormented her, and then allowed her to return home. This happened within a mile and a half of where Jacqueline was found. An interesting detail emerged. The girl Hernandez was living with at the time also owned a Chevy Malibu, and Perry often stayed overnight at her apartment. In fact, even on the night before Jacqueline's disappearance, someone had entered another home in Midlothian. Elizabeth Siki woke up in the middle of the night and thwarted an attempted robbery or abduction of her daughter. She identified the person she saw in her home that night as Perry Hernandez and expressed confidence that he intended to abduct her 7-year-old daughter, whom she found tightly wrapped in 3 towels, as if someone had intended to take her away. While this may seem like more than a coincidence, Judge Richard Neville stated that he did not consider this evidence and prohibited Cynthia and David's defense from presenting these facts in court. However, the little girl abducted by Perry Hernandez was invited to testify. She recalled that while she was with the kidnapper under the bridge, he held a rope, as if threatening her with it. Besides the striking similarities between the two cases, this demonstrated that a small child could indeed be taken from a bedroom without waking anyone. However, in court, the defense made a mistake by failing to establish a connection with the jury members. They wanted David to take the witness stand and firmly declare his innocence, looking them in the eye, but that didn't happen. The most significant obstacle for the defense turned out to be the 17 autopsy photographs and remains presented to the jury. The prosecutors claimed that the photos were meant to help determine the time and cause of death. The defense believed that these photos simply contributed to bias among the jury members. An attorney explains, "You're shown a beautiful girl next to a photograph of her body, and of course the jury members thought someone must pay for this crime. However, the photos didn't convince the judge, who dropped the charges against Cynthia because her only connection to the crime was being in the house. The judge ordered to keep his decision secret because David's fate still lay in the hands of the jury due to the testimony of Everett Mann. After 14 hours, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty. Everyone believed that David would be acquitted, and the media were already waiting for him outside the courthouse for interviews. It was a shock to everyone that he was found guilty. The judge sentenced David to 45 years in prison. Many didn't understand why the jury had no doubts about his guilt, but suddenly everything fell into place. In an interview with a reporter, the jury foreperson confessed why a guilty verdict was reached. It turns out that the jury saw photographs of the Dovalibi home. In one photo, the bedroom door of young Davy showed a dent from a fist, and the jurors believed this indicated David Dovalibi's violent nature. Coming to this conclusion, the jury members decided that there had been a lot of violence in the house. How wrong they were. The fist-sized dent had appeared long before David moved into the house with Cynthia, and perhaps even before Jacqueline's birth. David's younger brother had struck the door with his fist when he was a teenager. The house belonged to David's mother, and the family always had more important things to spend money on, and the door was never replaced. Neither the defense nor the prosecution mentioned this dent, so the jury's decision was based on things that were not even discussed in court. The jury foreperson added that if they had their way, they would have accused Cynthia as well. During this time, Cynthia fought for custody of Davy. Several psychologists and social workers testified, stating that there was no hint that Davy had ever been mistreated, and Cynthia was a kind and loving mother who doted on Davy, and he on her. By mid-July, Davy was allowed to return home to his mother and his recently born sister, Carly Marie. The fact that the jury was biased against David needed to be used to challenge the verdict. Cynthia and the family's friends formed a committee to fight for David's release. One committee member offered a $10,000 reward for any information about the crime. Additionally, the committee allowed them to connect with people who could assist with the case. One of those people turned out to be Robert Byman, an attorney from the Chicago law firm Jenner and Block, who volunteered to work on the case pro bono. Initially, due to police statements, he also believed in David's guilt, but after studying the case materials, he realized there was no evidence against him at all. He understood that David was wrongly accused due to human nature. Byman explained, 12 good and decent members of the jury were entrusted with deciding the fate of this case. Their choice was simple, to stand up and leave, saying, "Sorry, Jacqueline, we can't do anything for you," or to convict the only person sitting before them. They chose the latter. In October, Robert Byman filed a petition for David's release based on new evidence. Gerald Bauman, a prisoner at Cook County Jail, claimed that he had overheard Perry Hernandez confess to the murder. However, after the petition was filed, Gerald refused to sign his previously given sworn statements, fearing for his safety, and claimed that he had received threats after news of this new evidence came to light. The appeal garnered such a significant response that, for the first time, the Illinois Appellate Court allowed video recording of the case proceedings. The Illinois Appellate Court had three options: uphold the guilty verdict, order a new trial, or completely exonerate David, which would mean he could never be tried for this case again. 5 months later, the court's decision was announced. Complete exoneration. The court ruled that the chief witness's testimony had been inaccurate and unreliable, and the prosecutors had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that David was the only person with the opportunity to commit the crime. The judges noted that all the basement windows had been left unlocked that night, and any of them could have allowed the perpetrator inside, but unfortunately they were not checked for fingerprints. They also criticized the decision to show the jury 17 gruesome body photographs that were unnecessary. On November 13, 1991, after spending 18 months in prison, David walked free. I've been a lawyer for almost 30 years, and in all that time there have only been 3 times when I was as happy as I was the day I walked David Dovalibi out of prison. Our judicial system is designed to work in 95% of cases. This time the system failed. It convicted an innocent man, said Robert Byman. However, the Dovalibi family was about to experience yet another shocking turn of events in one of the most paradoxical and unusual murder sagas in modern Chicago history. It became known that Rob Warden and David Protess, who were writing a book about the case titled Gone in the Night, had discovered a new potential suspect. Timothy Guess was a 31-year-old brother of Jacqueline's biological father. Timothy had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and lived in a house with his mother not far from Jacqueline's home. Initially, he claimed to have been working at the Park Avenue restaurant in Harvey on the night of the murder, and 3 restaurant employees confirmed his alibi. However, now 2 of them had recanted their statements. At least 5 regulars of the establishment also claimed that Timothy wasn't there that night. Warden and Protess spoke to Timothy, who told them that he often heard voices in his head and suffered from memory lapses. He told them that he was guided by a spirit, and this spirit had allowed him to describe the layout of the Dovalibi house, even though he had never been inside. He could even describe how to get to Jacqueline's bedroom. Timothy described the blanket in which the body was wrapped, and somehow knew that the light in the bedroom was off on the night of her disappearance. However, Timothy was never seriously considered a suspect even after this information came to light. He passed away in 2002. Protest said, "I felt that the case was solved, but I never thought anyone would be held accountable for the crime. The state would be too embarrassed to admit they had wrongly accused Cynthia and David." Since then, the Dovalibi family has moved and changed their last name due to the excessive attention on their lives. They still hope that Jacqueline's murder will be solved. Something terrible happened in that ranch-style home in Midlothian, Illinois, on the night of September 9, 1988. But 3 decades later, there are still no answers as to what exactly transpired. While the local police claim the case is open, there are evidently no leads being pursued. Every U.S. citizen has the right to invoke the Fifth Amendment, but when Cynthia and David exercised that right, they found themselves at the center of a wrongly and negligently conducted investigation. In 1989, the industrial growth in the American state of Indiana allowed certain businesses to reach unprecedented heights, with businessmen reaping the benefits. John Parker was one of them. John started working at a very young age. As a teenager, he took a job at a restaurant clearing dishes from tables. However, this was not enough for the ambitious young man, and he ventured into selling vacuum cleaners. Going door-to-door selling vacuum cleaners doesn't usually earn much. Even his own family mocked John's choice. The laughter stopped when, just a few months later, the 19-year-old broke all sales records. It seemed like he went from nothing to a super successful person overnight, but that wasn't the case. John worked tirelessly for his goals, putting in 12 to 16 hours a day. Despite his hard work, he wasn't selfish and willingly shared his knowledge and experience to inspire colleagues to excel in their work. Confident and very charismatic, the young man moved to Michigan, where he opened his own vacuum cleaner sales center. The wave of success brought 20-year-old Judy Hicks to his shore. Judy was self-assured and assertive, but she had to be. Unlike John, who grew up in a middle-class family, Judy knew poverty. She married very young and became a mother of 2 children, Christina and Danny. However, her married life didn't work out, and after the divorce, to make ends meet and take care of her children, she also decided to start selling vacuum cleaners. John helped her, first as a colleague, then as a lover. The closer they became, the more successful the business developed. Judy became his right-hand woman. Every time he gave a speech, John started by saying he wouldn't have achieved anything without Judy. The couple married at the end of 1992 and opened a training center for other sales professionals, J&J Parker Industries. By the age of 30, John became a millionaire, and his family grew with 2 more daughters, Tiffany and Erica. Christina and Danny also called John their dad, spent a lot of time at the office with their parents, and it was impossible to tell that John wasn't the biological father of the older children. The family led a deliberately luxurious lifestyle. This was one of John's philosophies, to radiate success so that his employees would also strive for success. He was an idol of the youth of that generation. However, after 10 years of marriage, many things changed. John, once a cheerful and content man, turned into a bundle of nerves. However, not without reason. His wife cheated on him with their colleague. John became suspicious and installed several surveillance cameras at work, which confirmed his wife's affair. It was a severe blow to his ego. He started drinking. Judy begged him to hand over the incriminating video, but John refused. It would give him a significant advantage in divorce proceedings. However, he had no intention of divorcing. As he jokingly told a friend, it's cheaper to keep her, so John decided to take his wife as far away from her lover as possible. The family returned to Indiana and settled in the prestigious neighborhood of Crown Point. John opened an office in Merrillville, Indiana, and disbanded the office staff in Michigan. He brought with him only his most loyal employees, including his trusted confidant, Ben. John brought Ben from Michigan and began training him in everything so that when he decided to step back from business, it would continue to thrive. Together, they built a business empire and seemed to be living better than they could have ever imagined. However, on Thursday, April 17, 2003, the emergency services received 2 calls reporting an armed attack in the warehouse district where John Parker's company office was located. The calls came from John's wife, Judy Parker, and his manager, Ben. When the police arrived, they first searched the entire area, including dumpsters and rooftops, in case the suspect was hiding somewhere. Finding no one, they returned to the crime scene and to John Parker, as he turned out to be the victim. His car was parked in front of the office, and he was found lying on the ground with a single bullet hole in the back of his head. The gunshot wound was fatal. A casing from a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol was found nearby the body. What surprised investigators was that a second identical casing was found some distance away from the victim. The man's wallet was missing from his pocket, and at first glance, it appeared to be a botched robbery. While the medical examiner took the body for autopsy, investigators had to find out from Ben and Judy what they had seen. In Judy's account, she behaved unusually calmly, which the detectives attributed to shock. She explained that in the evening, she and her husband had dinner at a local restaurant while their 4 children stayed home watching a movie. One of their younger daughters, Tiffany, had been misbehaving at school, and the couple wanted to discuss discipline for her. The next day was the start of spring break, so it was clear the girl would be spending all her days at home. At some point, their daughter Christina called and said that Tiffany had left her homework in the office, so the couple stopped by to pick it up. While John exchanged a few words with Ben, Judy retrieved their daughter's work and went back to the car. The couple intended to pass some leftover food from the restaurant to Ben. John walked over to the car and opened the rear passenger door behind the driver's seat. Judy saw her husband open the car door, and almost immediately 2 loud bangs rang out. She ducked down, and when she looked up, she saw John fall, and a person dressed all in black quickly running away from the car. It was dark, and she couldn't make out who it was. This story puzzled the detectives. Typically, a robber rarely shoots the victim immediately. Usually, there's a short conversation that escalates before it comes to gunfire, but not this time. They suspected it wasn't a botched robbery. Furthermore, besides the wallet, John was wearing a Rolex watch and other valuable men's jewelry. Judy mentioned that her husband, as a businessman, often had conflicts with other people. He was very demanding of himself and his colleagues. About 3 weeks before the murder, he had a heated argument with a former employee right in the office parking lot. The men exchanged harsh words, and police intervention was required to separate them. Company manager Ben confirmed that such an argument took place. John accused the former employee of not returning all the equipment after his departure. The employee, in turn, believed that he hadn't received all the owed payment. However, everything was resolved. The employee returned the equipment and received the appropriate payment. This turned out to be a dead-end lead that didn't lead anywhere. John was killed on a Thursday evening. However, the previous Monday, a school officer from Crown Point contacted the Merrillville police. He learned about the murder from the news and wanted to share important information. For about 6 months, he had known about a conspiracy to murder John Parker involving 3 teenagers. 2 of them were caught with a large sum of cash. The school became suspicious of how 15-year-old students had such a large sum of money, so they questioned them. Although they were interviewed separately, their stories completely matched. They told of their classmate Danny, John Parker's stepson, paying them to kill his stepfather. The seized money was only part of the sum. In reality, they received several $1,000s. However, they deceived Danny, having no intention of even coming close to his stepfather. Since the boys had no intention of committing murder, the school simply confiscated the money and did not pursue the matter further. They didn't even contact Danny's parents or interview him about the incident. Yet, this was an opportunity to learn more about the issues clearly evident in the family. Now, 6 months later, John was dead, murdered, and the police had to determine whether his stepson could be involved. Investigators began interviewing family members, friends, and neighbors of John. The overall impression was that he was an excellent boss and friend, well-liked despite being quite strict and having a volatile temper. John worked very hard but spent every evening with his family. However, it became increasingly difficult for him to keep track of his teenage children, 17-year-old Christina and 15-year-old Danny. Little Christina was simply a wonderful child, but when her mother married John and she was plunged into a world of newfound financial possibilities, all the girl wanted to do was party, enjoy life, and throw parties in their new big house. Soon, she started getting into trouble. Her younger brother Danny wasn't far behind. He was generally more spirited and restless than his sister, and his antics were accordingly mischievous. One evening, without permission and without a driver's license, he took his father's SUV and knocked over mailboxes of neighbors. After that, John had to go around to all of them and negotiate so they wouldn't report his stepson's actions to the police. It's worth noting that John himself grew up in a family with very strict rules and tried to impose similar rules on his family so that the older children wouldn't get into trouble with the law. Of course, the teenagers didn't like this and rebelled. And what about Judy? She preferred to be a friend rather than a mother to Christina and Danny. The parents seemed to be clearly divided into good and bad cops. What was most horrifying was that the younger girls saw the atmosphere in the house unfold and also didn't listen. After learning about the family situation, investigators hurried even more to find the 2 classmates of Danny and interview him himself. Danny did not deny conflicts with his stepfather, who tried to raise him as best he could. He admitted to giving money to his classmates, but not to kill John, just to scare and beat him up. And he had the money simply because he had been saving it for some time. Danny was still detained, and detectives had to find out if 2 teenagers accidentally killed John while trying to scare him. It turned out that one of the boys was in prison on the day of the murder, and the other lived in Las Vegas with his grandmother. Detectives went to Vegas and spoke with the teenager. He insisted that Danny had tried to persuade someone to actually kill his stepfather. But he and his friend tricked Danny and took the money without intending to commit murder. Police confirmed that the boy was in Vegas on April 17th, so this turned out to be another dead end. Danny was released home. Meanwhile, John's farewell took place. The man himself liked to repeat that people would forget your name, forget what you said, but they would not forget the feelings you evoked in them. At his funeral, everyone remembered what a wonderful person he was and how positively he influenced those around him. But someone directly stated that the worst part wasn't that John lay in a coffin, but that the person responsible for his death was probably in the same building with them. It was an unpleasant, oppressive feeling shared by everyone. But a week later, the image of the perfect family took another hit when a colleague of John's revealed a new lead, this time involving his stepdaughter, 17-year-old Christina. An employee of J&J Parker Industries disclosed that Christina, who also worked in her parents' company, approached him to find a hitman to kill her stepfather. For her troubles, she gave him $100 and handed over an additional $500 as a down payment for the hitman. Incredibly, this was another plot to kill John, which ended with Christina being deceived once again. However, suspicion now fell not only on Danny, but also on Christina. The girl denied everything, claiming she simply complained to her colleague about her stepfather, and he misunderstood her. Without details from Christina regarding the money exchange, investigators again hit a dead end. Was this a coincidence? Or had the teenagers conspired and were hiding a much darker plan? Several weeks later, a month after John Parker's murder, the police stumbled upon another lead leading to Christina's classmates. Under pressure, they confessed to selling a weapon to Christina that was used for shooting practice on a family farm. Officers found a tree with bullet marks on the farm, and on the ground, they discovered casings. Ballistics analysis confirmed that the casings matched those found at the crime scene. Now the police could link Christina to the purchase of the weapon, but the girl simply denied everything. And since the police didn't have the murder weapon in hand, and Christina had an alibi, she was watching a movie at home with her younger sisters, they couldn't prove that she killed John. So who pulled the trigger? The circle narrowed around family members, but for the prosecutor it wasn't enough. There was only a conspiracy, but no weapon, and no person to pin it on. Meanwhile, without John, his family and business gradually fell apart. Judy spent all her time with her new boyfriend Ben, John's right-hand man. The children were forced to take care of themselves, cooking and cleaning the house. This spoke volumes because after a tragedy, a parent instinctively seeks to spend more time with their children. Judy did just the opposite, indicating she wasn't truly attached to her husband or children. The business also declined, and Judy and the children struggled financially. Judy was supposed to receive $1 million from 2 of John's insurance policies, but because the investigation was ongoing, the insurance company refused to pay her. Judy and Ben moved with the younger girls to Michigan. Danny and his biological father went to Arizona, where the boy found work on a construction site. Christina, expecting her first child, stayed in Indiana with her boyfriend Eric. Only John's close friends and family continued to push for the investigation to continue, which it did without ceasing. In 2007, 4 years after John's murder, a detective from the narcotics department contacted one of the investigators on the case. He informed them that Christina's husband, Eric Grabsky, was involved in a drug-related investigation, and there was already a warrant out for his arrest. Detectives seized the opportunity to glean new information about the old case. They speculated that the hope of a deal with the prosecution would loosen Eric's tongue, and they were not wrong. Eric knew who killed John. The triggerman turned out to be Christina's younger brother, Danny. The question was whether Christina would confirm her husband's words. Eric called her and she agreed to come to the station. She stated that her stepbrother Danny had killed her stepfather. However, initially she tried to downplay her role, minimizing her involvement in the case. But investigators had already determined that she purchased the weapon, and it was she who called her parents about her sister's homework, even though school holidays, including Easter, were starting the next day, so there was no rush to collect Tiffany's homework. Therefore, detectives knew that Christina played an active role in the murder. They pressured her, and she confessed that she knew about all the conspiracies to kill John. She, her brother, and her mother had spent over a year trying to find someone willing to kill John, spending several $1,000s on their search. But after multiple unsuccessful attempts with incompetent contractors, they decided that Danny would do it. Detectives flew to Arizona, where Danny lived and worked. When an investigator approached him and mentioned being from Merrillville, Danny visibly softened. The detective asked, "Do you know why I'm here?" To which Danny replied, "I'm ready to tell everything." It was clear that this weighed heavily on him, and he regretted what had happened. Here's what he revealed. The murder of John was Judy's plan. She constantly told the children that she couldn't live with John anymore, that he mistreated her and was abusive. However, when Danny was asked if he ever witnessed such behavior towards his mother, he couldn't recall anything of the sort. Moreover, the police never responded to the family's address. Also, the mother promised the older children that life would be much better without John. They would have money and no control from a strict stepfather who demanded that the children study well and behave properly. Initially, Judy attempted to poison her husband personally, but she failed. Then she and the children began looking for someone willing to carry out this job for money. However, finding a killer and buying a weapon required money. To secretly obtain such large sums from her husband, Judy forged company checks. She stole $7,500 and John was about to find out about it. Ultimately, Judy decided they would do everything themselves. She devised a plan in which all three would have alibis. The mother decided her 15-year-old son, Danny, would commit the murder. Christina's role was to call and lure John to the office. Christina gave Danny the keys to her car, even though he didn't even have a driver's license yet. The accomplices took a huge risk, and at any moment, things could have gone awry. Nevertheless, the teenager climbed out of his bedroom window to avoid being noticed by his younger sisters, got in the car, drove to the office, and waited. He saw the parents arrive, hid behind a dumpster, and waited for an opportunity to shoot. When John approached the car and opened the door, Danny ran up and fired. The gun accidentally fired a second time when he tried to reach for the man's wallet, hence the second shell casing being far from the body. This clarified one of the mysteries that had been troubling the investigators. Danny then fled, got into the car, and quickly returned home, where Christina awaited with a bag into which he placed his clothes, the weapon, and the wallet. He took a shower, and they didn't discuss it further. Christina later handed the bag to her mother, and Judy disposed of it. Following Christina and Danny's confessions, both were arrested. Now the police had to arrest the puppeteer behind her husband's murder, Judy Parker, but the police had absolutely nothing against her. Fortunately, her children agreed to testify against their mother in exchange for reduced sentences. Then Judy decided to confess her guilt in 2009. Christina was sentenced to 5 years in prison for her role in the crime. However, after her release in 2013, she died of a drug overdose at the age of 27. Danny was sentenced to 23 years. He was released 3 years after his sister in 2016. Judy was sentenced to 33 years in prison. She was released in 2023. Judy spent her entire life as a sales agent, and she certainly found a way to sell the idea of murder to her own children. Most likely, she manipulated them for years, and only when they were distanced from her could they clearly see the whole picture. Of course, Judy could have divorced, but she would have received only half of the property and wouldn't have received the $1 million from the insurance. Additionally, John had evidence of marital infidelity. He gave his wife a ticket to a luxurious life, but she no longer wanted to see her husband nearby, yet she wanted to have it all, and anyone standing in her way between the life she had and the life she wanted had to disappear. She forced her teenage children to commit murder, robbing them of their childhood and burdening them with a heavy load, and she shattered the lives of her younger daughters, who now have no father, no older sister, and essentially no mother. On April 18, 2011, Jessica Bullock couldn't sit still all day. It had been a whole day since she had been able to reach her mother, 46-year-old Rebecca or Becky Porter, whereas they usually talked every day. Jessica was particularly concerned because her mother had been complaining of feeling unwell, possibly food poisoning or something similar. Jessica urged her mother to go to the hospital, but Becky, who disliked missing work, kept putting it off. On April 17th, the last time they spoke, Becky promised her daughter she would check on herself in the morning. Yet, evening had come the next day, and there was still no word from her mother. Jessica checked with other family members, but they couldn't reach Becky either. Jessica deserves credit. She could have assumed that with Becky's husband, Russell, or Rusty, as his relatives lived nearby, there was no cause for concern. But no, she decided to check in person. Jessica got into her car and drove 45 minutes to her mother's house. She hadn't been there many times, but she immediately sensed that something was wrong. One of the doors was wide open. Lights were on inside the house, and her mother's car was parked in the driveway. Jessica approached the door and called out for her mother, but all she got in response was chilling silence. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie. The only illuminated house in the middle of a large plot of land, seemingly occupied but unresponsive to calls. Fearing what she might find inside, around midnight, Jessica contacted the Greene County, Missouri Rescue Service. The responding police officers thoroughly searched all the rooms and informed Jessica that there were no intruders inside. However, they couldn't calm her down because there was nobody in the house at all. Instead, they encountered a plethora of details that alarmed even the experienced officers. Disorder reigned in the bedroom. Items were strewn across the floor, including bedding, and the mattress was askew, as if someone had abruptly jumped out of bed. Becky's phone and purse containing credit cards, cash, and documents were left behind. Rusty's medications lay on the bedside table. He took them daily after his cancerous tumor removal, and he would have taken them with him if they had left. However, how could the couple have left the house if their only car, which they shared, was parked at home with the keys in the ignition? In another room, likely a home office, a tangle of cables lay on the floor. But the most alarming discoveries awaited the officers in the kitchen. First and foremost, they were almost overwhelmed by the strong smell of bleach. Puddles of bleach were gleaming on the floor, yet the only bleach bottle under the sink was completely full. The kitchen window was open, and the protective screen on it was torn. Finally, after circling around the house, the officers discovered scattered broken surveillance cameras. It seemed like initially they were positioned to cover maximum area around the house, but someone had walked around the house and destroyed them all. Some cables connected to these cameras ran through the walls of the house, leading to the same home office where the tangle of wires lay. When the officers returned to the room, they realized that the cameras and monitor on the floor were connected to a computer, which was conspicuously absent. This was one of the most telling pieces of evidence, especially considering that Rusty had installed the cameras quite recently. Moreover, it's not common for people to install so many cameras in the middle of a farm. Was Rusty afraid of something? All the findings suggested that the spouses weren't together at the time of their sudden disappearance. The first theory of the detectives was that perhaps Becky and Rusty became victims of a botched nighttime robbery. However, the evidence didn't support this theory. Besides the car and cash, other valuable items like the television remained untouched. Maybe Rusty got into trouble, owed money to someone, and the couple decided to disappear this way. Did one spouse do something to the other, get scared of the crime committed, and flee? Or did someone attack them in the middle of the night? At that moment, investigators were considering numerous scenarios, each worse than the other, and doubted a favorable outcome. The police began questioning friends and relatives of the couple, starting with Rusty's mother, Kay Simmons, who lived in a small house directly behind the family home. She recounted that Rusty and Becky had only been married for about a year. The newlyweds moved into the house on the 49-acre property owned by Kay's parents. Also, less than a kilometer away from the young couple, Kay's brother and Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell, lived with his wife Carolyn. Rusty and Becky seemed like a very happy couple, but their relationship raised doubts among their close circle. Some were uneasy about the 12-year age gap between the spouses, and Jessica and her brother even skipped their mother's wedding. On the evening of the previous day, the 17th, Rusty's son dropped by to ask his mother for painkillers because Becky wasn't feeling well. According to Kay, Rusty behaved as usual and didn't tell his mother anything that would worry her. She also didn't hear any strange sounds later that night. But when she stepped onto the porch the next morning, she saw Becky's car. Kay was surprised because Becky was a very responsible, hard-working woman who never left for work later than 7:30. Despite her son and daughter-in-law living just a few steps away from her house, she tried not to intrude and didn't go to them, simply assuming that Becky stayed home because she was unwell. But now she was certain that something had happened to her son and daughter-in-law before the morning of the 18th. Meanwhile, detectives questioned her about Rusty and Becky's relationship. Did they have any problems? Could anyone have harbored a grudge against them? And Kay immediately thought of one person. Before marrying Rusty, Becky spent 26 years in a marriage with a church pastor. However, they decided to divorce, and according to their friends, they couldn't part amicably. The former spouses fought for a long time over ownership rights of the restaurant they had previously managed together. They had been divorced for only 4 months when Becky met her future husband online. Naturally, this piqued the interest of investigators, and on the 4th day of the investigation, they questioned the ex-husband. However, it quickly became apparent that he had no connection to Becky and Rusty's disappearance. Although their divorce was accompanied by scandals, the man continued to live his life, and he had a solid alibi for the time of the couple's disappearance. Moreover, he seemed genuinely upset about what could have happened to them. After ruling out Becky's ex-husband, the police continued to delve into the personal lives of the newlyweds. Once again, the investigators quickly uncovered something interesting. Becky had complained that she couldn't stand it anymore and things couldn't continue like this. When the police questioned her daughter Jessica about this, she said that her mother had confided in her that she and her husband had been arguing frequently lately. Of course, various negative scenarios immediately sprang to the detectives' minds, suggesting that Rusty might have done something to Becky and then fled. However, unlike Becky's family, all of Rusty's relatives and friends unanimously insisted that he sincerely loved his wife, and they had never seen him happier. He truly loved her and had changed for the better because of her. So why did the woman complain to her daughter about problems? It turned out that Becky had grievances, not against her husband, but against his family. specifically against one person. Becky's grievances were directed towards Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell. Robert lived nearby Rusty and Becky on the same 49-acre property. Kay and her brother Robert had always been very close, but he didn't like the fact that his nephew had settled on the property, which he likely considered entirely his own. He was very possessive about anything that belonged to his parents, down to the smallest details. The rift between uncle and nephew had escalated to the point where both had tried to obtain restraining orders against each other multiple times. The last time Rusty filed a complaint against his uncle was 1 or 2 weeks before the disappearance. In his statement, Rusty described how Robert, passing by the couple's house, shouted that Rusty should be careful because he wouldn't stay there for long. When investigators spoke to Robert, he didn't deny the obvious and admitted that his relationship with his nephew was strained, but he claimed that the threats were just words without meaning. Moreover, he had more reason to fear Rusty, as he was just an old man with health problems, and of course, he would never harm his nephew or his wife. Additionally, Robert had a very solid alibi. He worked as a long-haul truck driver, and during the couple's disappearance, he was headed to Texas with his wife. This was confirmed by phone records for both Robert and his wife, Carolyn. With Becky's ex-husband and Rusty's uncle ruled out as suspects, investigators hit a dead end. However, another crime shook them out of it. On April 25th, a week after the couple's disappearance, police were called to the scene of a double homicide of another married couple. The second crime eerily resembled the disappearance of the Porter couple, and it also began with a call to 911. Early in the morning around 5 o'clock, a neighbor of the couple called emergency services and said he had scared off a stranger wearing a black hoodie. The person ran away down the road. When officers arrived, they found Donald and Helen Willingham murdered. They had been attacked with a knife. The similarities were striking. An unknown assailant had broken into both couples' homes. Almost nothing was stolen, and there were no obvious suspects. Furthermore, Donald was a pastor, and Becky had been married to a pastor for over 20 years. Investigators pondered whether the cases were connected, or if it was just an astonishing coincidence. Was there a serial killer roaming the county, targeting married couples? However, a breakthrough occurred in the Donald and Helen Willingham case 3 months later. A young man named Jose Huckleberry was arrested on charges of robbery. After 7 hours of interrogation, he confessed to the murders. When detectives learned his motive and the details of the attacks, they had to admit that these two cases were not linked. The situation for the investigation was not improving. All the evidence collected up to that point suggested that Rusty and Becky's disappearance was linked to some crime. But what? Now the investigators had neither a motive nor any suspects. The couple's relatives and friends did everything possible to keep the public aware of the case. They printed a huge number of flyers and posted them in all frequented places, gave interviews to local media, and of course, continued to cling to the only glimmer of hope in the realm of dark thoughts and forebodings. Hope. Despite the grim circumstances, the community remained supportive, rallying around the missing couple's loved ones and assisting in any way they could. The search for Rusty and Becky continued, fueled by determination and the unwavering belief that answers would eventually surface. And suddenly, completely unexpectedly, a new lead emerged. A prisoner serving time in the local jail came forward with information that would interest investigators. Shortly before his arrest, he was relaxing in a bar where he met a man named Tony Friend. They struck up a conversation during which Tony boasted about several crimes he had committed. Among them was the murder of Rusty and Becky Porter. Detectives were skeptical of the informant, who naturally came forward only in hopes of striking a deal with the prosecutor. However, they were obligated to investigate. At the very least, they needed to find out who this Tony Friend was. The more they delved into the man's past, the fewer doubts remained about the informant's words. Tony Friend, 43, had a history of repeated involvement in violent attacks and armed robberies, rather than minor offenses, indicating a propensity for cruelty. However, it was only after examining his phone data that detectives believed they had a solid lead. On the night of April 17th, he was in close proximity to Rusty and Becky Porter's home, and then he headed towards the Cedar Creek area, known for its vast expanse of dense forest, although investigators didn't know exactly where. They invited him in for questioning, but it proved to be a futile exercise. Tony denied any connection to the couple, claiming he hadn't committed any crimes and had no knowledge of the matter. He didn't answer most of the questions, and those he did answer were so evasive that essentially the only thing he confirmed was his name and age. Detectives had hoped for a more fruitful outcome, but they were now convinced that they needed to dig deeper in this direction. Knowing that Tony had been near the missing couple's home before heading towards Cedar Creek, investigators decided to speak with his relatives and friends. Since Tony grew up in the area, he likely knew it well, and there could have been a secluded spot known only to his close acquaintances. They were right. Tony's cousin immediately recalled a place where they used to play as children. It was an area with dense vegetation near Cedar Creek, inaccessible by car. The kids called it the bulldozer spot because that's where old, non-functional cars were dumped. There were also dilapidated and abandoned cabins, which had been falling apart since they were children. The woman led the police to this location, and it turned out to be the piece of information they had been missing. On July 21st, the police headed to the specified location in Cedar Creek, specifically to the old cabin where Tony used to play with his friends in his childhood. Immediately, they detected a distinct smell, the unmistakable odor of decomposition. In the center of the dilapidated cabin, amidst piles of debris, they found a hole in the wooden floor. Inside, they discovered the bodies of two individuals, still dressed in their pajamas. Blood at the scene indicated that they were killed right there. The bodies had significantly decomposed, and investigators relied on dental records and DNA to confirm their identities. It was Rusty and Becky. Autopsies revealed that each of them had died from a single gunshot wound to the right temple, fired at close range. The discovery of the bodies dashed the last hopes of Becky and Russell's family to see them alive. It was even more difficult for them because they couldn't comprehend why someone would do such a thing. It was an execution-style murder. However, the investigators' task shifted from searching for bodies to finding the killer, and all circumstantial evidence pointed to one suspect. The police had another ace up their sleeve. Despite Tony's hardened criminal background, modern technology played a crucial role in the investigation. Officers revisited Tony's phone data and discovered that 3 of his close associates, his wife, Wendy Friend, his son, Philip Friend, and his nephew, Dusty Hicks, had followed a similar path to Tony on the night of April 17th, the day the couple went missing. If Tony remained tight-lipped, perhaps they could pressure one of them. Investigators identified 26-year-old Philip, Tony's son, as the weakest link among the accomplices. During the period between the couple's disappearance and the discovery of the bodies, Philip had been implicated in a theft and was serving time in prison. He had already experienced incarceration, so when detectives threatened him with charges of double homicide, he agreed to talk. On December 17th, the young man revealed that his father had offered him a job to ensure that 2 individuals would never celebrate another birthday. It was criminal slang for murder, and Philip understood the gravity of the task and agreed to it. So, on April 17th, according to the boy's account, his father, Wendy, Dusty, and he got into the car and headed to Rusty and Becky's house. Wendy stayed in the car while the others put on gloves, balaclavas, taped the cuffs of their sleeves and pants with tape to not leave a single hair at the crime scene, grabbed a bottle of cleaning solution with bleach, and headed towards the family's home. They destroyed the cameras and searched the entire house for a way inside, but they were unsuccessful. They were about to leave when Dusty noticed a partially open kitchen window. They cut through the protective screen, pushed the window open, and Tony helped Dusty crawl inside. Dusty then opened the back door. The accomplices then entered the couple's bedroom. They startled Rusty and Becky awake, and Dusty and Tony pointed their weapons at them. Naturally, they were terrified, begged for mercy, and didn't understand who had burst into their home and what they wanted. But the criminals had more important matters to attend to than explaining anything to their victims. They generously poured bleach all over the kitchen floor, took the computer where the surveillance camera footage was stored, and, after tying the victims' hands with zip ties, led them to the car. It's remarkable how much effort the accomplices put in to avoid getting caught. In light of this, it's simply astonishing that Tony himself confessed his involvement in this to a stranger in a bar. Be that as it may, they dropped off Wendy at home and went to the location chosen by Tony, now known to the police. The accomplices parked the car in a field right in front of the dense forest, so vast that no one would hear a gunshot or screams. Tony instructed Dusty and Philip to wait while he led the spouses away. In their pajamas, barefoot, at gunpoint, they obediently walked into the woods. It's hard to imagine what they were feeling at that moment. Surely they understood they wouldn't be coming back, but they obediently pressed forward. According to Philip, he and Dusty sat for 10 minutes when they heard a gunshot, and it was only another 10 minutes later that the second shot rang out. The horror those 10 minutes must have been for the second victim. Tony never revealed what happened in that abandoned shack in the middle of the dense forest. There are many self-evident assumptions about this, but due to lack of evidence, they remain just that. And Philip could only talk about what he knew for sure. And according to his admission, it was only when his father emerged from the darkness of the forest alone that he began to understand what they had just done. After Philip's confession, investigators had only one question left that demanded an answer. although they already suspected the answer. Why did his father decide to kill two people he had never even met before? For this job, he was promised $100,000. And for Philip, this was no secret. It was Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell, and his wife, Carolyn, Tony's sister. It was Robert who was the mastermind behind the murder, planning the attack for a time when he himself was supposed to be away in Texas. In fact, aside from disputes over the 49-hectare plot of land they lived on, he had a second motive. Robert was selling stolen equipment and using his property for these purposes. Rusty and Becky didn't like this, and they weren't going to stay silent about it. They raised a fuss that annoyed Robert. Becky was very afraid that unknown individuals were lurking around their home, so her husband installed cameras facing different directions from the house. Irritated by their behavior, Robert decided to get rid of them, to silence them forever. Naturally, he turned to Tony, a hardened criminal, and conveniently enough, his wife's brother. As the police learned, he approached Tony with a request to kill his nephew. Tony inquired about Becky, to which Robert coldly replied, "If she's there too, then kill her too." Tony agreed. Robert was arrested, but he stubbornly denied everything. He constantly reminded the investigators that he had an alibi. When the charges were brought against him, Tony and Dusty pleaded guilty. Tony and Dusty were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder. Wendy decided to try her luck in court, was found guilty, and received a similar punishment. Robert also opted for trial, which made prosecutors nervous. Except for Philip's testimony, they had nothing solid against him. However, Philip agreed to testify against him and performed well in court. It was thanks to him that Robert was convicted. He was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. He will never see the light of day again. For his cooperation and willingness to plead guilty, Philip was sentenced to 13 years. Robert's wife, Carolyn, took her own life, unable to bear it all. She faced charges only for perjury. Arguments in people's lives are common and inevitable, and nobody really expects that a dispute will result in such consequences as murder. Becky and Rusty didn't like Robert's illegal side job, and they didn't hesitate to speak out about it directly. They knew it was dangerous. Becky openly feared the suspicious individuals who appeared near their home, and Rusty even installed a series of cameras to protect his wife. Unfortunately, it didn't save them. On that fateful night, when the couple walked into the woods in their pajamas and barefoot, did they suspect that Uncle Robert was to blame? Wishing to get rid of the troublesome nephew and free up the house? Did the killer say anything to them before pulling the trigger? Or did the spouses believe to the last that it was some random attack, and the quarrels with Uncle Robert were just silly arguments, and he would never harm his nephew and his wife? Christmas 2017 didn't start off well for the Aguilar family from Elche, Spain. The family owns a bakery, so the holidays are the busiest time for their business. Spouses Rosa and Alberto Aguilar decided not to keep all the earnings at home and took them to the bank. But when Rosa approached the cupboard where the family kept the money, only small change fell out of the pouch. 6,000 or 7,000 euros were missing. The spouses were afraid they had been robbed, but the door lock was intact, and there were no signs of a break-in in the house either. Then they decided that perhaps their daughter Patricia knows more. Patricia Aguilar is the eldest child of Alberto and Rosa. 2 weeks ago, she turned 18. Patricia was a typical teenager, albeit a bit introverted and shy. She studied art and spent a lot of time in her room on the computer. Her parents were worried that she had few friends and was becoming reclusive. Therefore, Rosa was very happy when her daughter said she had been invited to a birthday party. The girl left with an overnight bag and has not returned since. Her parents wrote and called her, but she did not answer. They didn't know what to think. Considering that the money went missing at the same time as Patricia, Alberto decided to contact the police. But the police were confident she would return soon and didn't rush to find the 18-year-old girl. By evening, the issue of money no longer concerned the parents. They wrote to Patricia that they wouldn't scold her as long as she returned home. That night, they couldn't close their eyes. When they finally received the message, "Everything is fine, I will contact you in a few hours," from their daughter Alberto and Rosa didn't buy it. The message was not written in the way their daughter would have done it. Now the parents were convinced that something had happened. The most likely scenario seemed to them that the thief who stole the money had kidnapped the girl and taken her phone. Rosa couldn't sit and wait, knowing that the police were not taking any action. So she went into her daughter's room and searched through all her belongings. Every book, notebook, pillow, stuffed toy. She even looked under the lamp and behind the paintings. She realized she had found what she was looking for, although it was not at all what she expected. There were some esoteric symbols, descriptions of rituals written by Patricia's hand, and also clear instructions for a trip and marriage registration in Peru, with descriptions of the necessary documents. Shocked, Rosa asked her husband if their daughter had run away to Peru to get married there, with whom. The police assured them that the girl had not crossed the country's borders. The plot thickened. Among her daughter's belongings, Rosa found photos of adult women she didn't know. Then for the first time, the thought crept into her mind that a cult might be behind all this, which she hurried to share with the police. But they dismissed her again, because 2 weeks ago the girl turned legal age and could do whatever she wanted. Weeks passed without any news, and Rosa and Alberto decided to turn to the public. They understood that the internet would be of invaluable help to them in this, but the Aguilar spouses were not familiar with it. They didn't even use social networks. Therefore, they turned to Noelia, Rosa's cousin. Patricia treated her as an older sister. Noelia responded in kind, and when her help was needed without hesitation, Noelia closed her shop in Benidorm and came to Elche. It was not difficult for her to find out that Patricia had been communicating a lot with some guy who sent her lists of books on black magic and esoterica. One word appeared particularly often in her notes: gnosis. As Noelia read, the concept of Gnosticism involves the search for knowledge, truth, but in the 1950s, several groups emerged claiming that allegedly to be saved in the apocalypse, one needed to cleanse oneself of sins. This could be done by engaging in intimate relationships as often as possible. Becoming carriers of such truth, the new followers of the doctrine had to renounce their families because other people were doomed, they were enemies. After finding all this out, Patricia's relatives realized that they didn't really know the girl and that she had been living a double life for a long time. A few more days passed, and Patricia got in touch. She wrote to Noelia that she was fine, but she wouldn't return, and attached a photo showing her holding a piece of paper with the date. She explained that she and her boyfriend were traveling in a mobile home across Europe, and they were currently in Petesti. But Petesti is in Romania, and the police assured them that the girl had not left Spanish territory. A quick search online told Noelia that on that day in Petesti, the temperature had dropped to -6 degrees Celsius, and the girl was wearing just a t-shirt. Noelia tried to call her back and found out that the girl's phone operator only serves South American countries. If, according to the police, Patricia had not left Spain, how did her phone do that? When Noelia tried to confront Patricia with this new information, she became agitated and rudely demanded to be left alone. But Noelia wasn't going to give up. In fact, the police were mistaken. On the very first day of her disappearance, when Patricia supposedly went to her friend's birthday party, she flew to Lima, Peru. After 2 years of online communication, she finally met her beloved, Stephen. He met her at the airport and immediately took her to a hotel. There, he became Patricia's first man. Thanks to the money she brought with her, they were able to rent a small apartment, where Patricia met 29-year-old Mariori Garcia Valverde and 42-year-old Paula Vega, the other, as he called them, wives of the man. Patricia knew she would become Stephen's third wife, but he didn't warn her that they would live with 4 children, Paula's daughter and 2 girls and a boy from Mariori. So 8 people ended up living in a small apartment, and there was no space for intimacy, which they were supposed to engage in every day. Stephen and Patricia met 2 years ago. It was a very difficult time for the teenage girl. Patricia had an uncle, her mother's brother, Jose. He loved his niece very much, spoiled her, spent time with her when her parents were busy. For Patricia, he was both an older brother and a father figure. However, in 2015, 29-year-old Jose fell ill. He was diagnosed with pancreatitis. People recover from this illness, but complications arose in Jose's case. He passed away within 4 months. The whole family was devastated. While Alberto was able to fully immerse himself in work, his wife Rosa and Patricia couldn't cope with the pain of loss. Rosa developed depression and found solace in simple computer games that allowed her to distract herself. Unfortunately, during this time, she distanced herself from her children and husband, and Patricia, who needed the support of her loved ones more than ever, became very vulnerable. She began to ponder what happens after death, as she could not accept that death was the end. She became interested in this topic, visited relevant websites, and she met Stephen, a man with very developed communicative and manipulative abilities. He studied psychology books to know how to penetrate the consciousness of every person. He called himself a savior, a messenger facing the impending end of the world, apocalypse. He made naive girls believe that they were a couple in a past life and that his wives, his queens, had a mission to populate the world after the apocalypse. Stephen realized that Patricia was the perfect victim because she was a teenager, and, as is often the case at that age, felt insecure and believed that nobody cared about her. All of this combined with her natural innocence. Stephen took advantage of her psychological vulnerability due to her uncle's death and used his persuasive methods to lure her into his traps. While her family was preoccupied, for 2 years Stephen worked on the girl's mind to isolate her, and no one noticed anything until it was too late. The girl believed she was safe because Stephen was on the other side of the globe. He gradually manipulated her, first asking for pictures in lingerie, then nude. Only after that did they discuss intimate moments, and the girl agreed that he had 2 wives. He explained this by saying that from a biological point of view, a man is created for relationships with many women, but a woman can only have one husband because a woman is a temple. Relationships with a man allow a woman to progress spiritually. A man can do this himself, but for a woman, this is the only way. And now, after 2 years of online communication, Patricia gave up everything and ran away to Stephen. He gave her a new name, Silvana, which means born in the jungle. But she had to get used not only to the new name. She had never taken forbidden substances, and Stephen made her consume a root that caused strong hallucinations. He didn't hesitate to give it to the children either. Meanwhile, the girl's family didn't give up trying to find her. They were lucky that Patricia left plenty of clues behind. Among her notes, Noelia found logins and passwords to computer games and social networks. One attracted her attention because it was repeated several times. Nicoli. It turned out to be the girl's secret page, where she expressed her thoughts about the afterlife. Among her friends, Noelia noticed a young man named Steven Martinez, and in his friends list there were only girls, 3,000 girls, all roughly Patricia's age. Noelia suspected that he might be behind all this. It was some progress, but for now, Noelia only found the guy's name on the internet. They needed evidence. Then the girl's mother searched Patricia's room again and noticed an interesting document. It turned out to be a medical certificate issued by a hospital in Lima, Peru, in the name of Paula Vega. Rosa realized they had stumbled upon a significant lead, finding Patricia's connection to Peru. The parents turned to the police, who passed the information to Interpol and eventually to the police in Peru. Stephen became nervous when the police called Paula and asked for clarification regarding Patricia. Even before Patricia's escape, he had asked her to forge a medical certificate for Paula, but instead of destroying the copy, she put it in a drawer in her room and completely forgot about it. And now they had problems. If Paula testified, the police would start digging deeper. Stephen decided to get Patricia out of trouble. They went together to the police station. Like a vulture, he watched her every word, controlling her every move. At his direction, the girl told the officers that nobody had kidnapped her and that she wanted to live in Peru. Since Patricia was of legal age, the police saw no crime. They simply let the couple go. This disappointed the girl's family, but at least they learned Stephen's full name, Felix Stephen Manrique Gomez, and they decided to change their approach, to turn to the media. This decision changed everything. The Aguilar family wanted as many people as possible to learn about Stephen's methods, to prevent him from luring other girls into his cult. It was risky because Stephen could either send Patricia home or flee with her. As it turned out, Stephen chose the third option. As soon as he saw his face on the news program, he smashed all the phones and computers and kicked Patricia out of the apartment. He ordered her to contact the embassy to get the opportunity to contact the media and fix everything. Until then, she would be alone on the street, without food or shelter. After a few days, she managed to reach out to a TV program and give an interview live. At first, her parents were relieved to see she was alive. But the things she said broke their hearts. The girl didn't hold back her words, aiming to hurt her parents to the core. She stated that she didn't want to know Rosa and Alberto because they were bad parents. Her father was never home, her mother played computer games for days, and nobody paid attention to her, didn't feed her or buy her clothes. She considered her Uncle Jose as her real father, and essentially her grandmother raised her. Patricia demanded that they remove all information from the internet, all photos, messages about the search, and send her money. Only then would she send them her address. After that, she would decide what to do next. Finally, she told her father, "Do you know why I was so happy in the photos from my birthday? I dreamed of running away since I was 14, and now I finally could leave home." It was painful for the parents to hear this, and many of their acquaintances and even relatives believed the girl's words. After such a shocking statement, both the police and the media lost interest in the case. But her family didn't give up. Noelia decided to make the most of social media opportunities. She created a fake profile similar to Patricia's, and requested to be friends with Stephen. She tried to portray herself as a teenage girl interested in esoterics, but perhaps she pressed too hard, asking for his phone number to communicate in Messenger. He suspected that she wasn't who she claimed to be, but mistook her for some Karen. He blocked her, but Noelia was already unstoppable. In Stephen's friend list, she found one Karen. It was a girl whose photo she had already seen among Patricia's belongings. Contacting her, Noelia learned that Karen had also been in the cult, but she managed to break free from Stephen's clutches. However, her sister Mai not only had been with him, but also was his only official wife. Karen confessed that she was afraid for her sister and advised reaching out to her mother Alinda. Perhaps she could help in some way. Despite Patricia partially managing to improve the situation with her interview, Stephen turned into a paranoid. He moved the girls and children to San Martin de Pangoa, a region 12 hours away from Lima by bus, in the middle of the jungle. It was a dangerous place with water and electricity shortages, and they could go weeks without bathing, both adults and children. There was also a lack of money for food. The meager coins they had were spent on candles and hallucinogenic roots that Stephen used during rituals. Patricia, now called Silva, deleted all her social media accounts, cut her long hair, and dyed it black. It was tough for the fugitives. A man with 3 women and 4 children, one of whom was clearly a foreigner. Cornered, Stephen became increasingly aggressive. He began mistreating Patricia very badly. Once he even told Mai, maybe we should just kill her, but it wasn't easier for the others. He severely beat the children and girls, using a leather whip, the effect of which was like being hit by 3 whips simultaneously. He beat the children for any reason, especially Mai's son, the only boy. Patricia got tired of this quickly and told Stephen that she would leave him, to which he threatened to take his anger out on the children. Despite the girls being willing to do anything for Stephen, even give their lives for him, he soon started asking for things that were beyond even their limits. Living nearby were girls who were rumored to be night butterflies despite their young age. Mai made the mistake of mentioning this to her husband. Stephen claimed that the girls would supposedly help him with a new ritual and demanded to arrange a meeting. But Mai couldn't do it because they were underage. She even considered Patricia too young for Stephen. The man became so enraged that he grabbed his wife by the neck and began to strangle her. She was almost suffocated and couldn't breathe. He would have killed her if Patricia hadn't intervened. Only then did Stephen release his victim. Patricia felt terrible, longing to return home to her parents but afraid of what they would say after all her actions. She lost her zest for life until suddenly everything changed. She realized she was expecting a child. Many advised the Aguilar family to forget about Patricia and stop searching, but her parents decided otherwise. Rosa stayed with her younger son in Elche, while Alberto went to Peru because they couldn't achieve much from Spain. But Peru was a large country, and Alberto was a stranger there, so he sought the support of Alinda, the mother of Karen and Mai. They found a prosecutor willing to help them, and the police began investigating, treating the case as one of human trafficking. The first place the officers visited was Patricia's apartment, from where Stephen had already taken her. Alberto could barely hold himself together when neighbors told stories of often hearing screams and blows and witnessing the girls being forced into intimate relationships in front of the children. Since Stephen had taken the children out of school and away with the girls in an unknown direction, detectives decided to track their phones. Stephen was horrified at the thought of being found, so the phones were almost always turned off. All they could do was wait for someone in the group to turn on their phone. Meanwhile, investigators found out who this Stephen was. The 35-year-old man was born in Lima into a poor and troubled family. He was bullied by other boys at school, which led him to spend time only with girls. From childhood, he learned how to manipulate them. His father gave him a book that helped Stephen join the Gnostics, but he was expelled because he drew ideas from other cults and called himself a prophet. Gradually, he came to found his own cult. When Stephen and the girls ran out of money, they moved to Alto Selindon, a tiny village with 30 houses. They settled into a hut right in the middle of the jungle. Mostly drug dealers and those avoiding the police, like them, inhabited the area. There was no water, electricity, or food in the hut. At best, they ate only rice and potatoes. Patricia was already 8 months pregnant, but due to severe malnutrition, it seemed like she was only in her 3rd month. The hut was surrounded by huge puddles, and everyone had to constantly wear boots. Fungal infections appeared on everyone's feet. even the children. Their feet were covered in insect bite marks, and their heads had colonies of lice. It was a disgusting place for them and the children, including the unborn ones, because Mai was also pregnant. Mai feared for her children's health. It was very difficult for her in such conditions. Despite her husband's prohibition, she turned on her phone and called her mother, just to hear her voice. The girl didn't even say anything, but it was enough for the police to trace the call. Detectives believed the fugitives were in Lima, but it turned out Stephen had taken them deep into the jungle. The police decided to send 2 officers to the region who knew the case best. They were given 10 days to search. They showed pictures of the group members to everyone passing by, assuming that the girl resembling Patricia would stand out among the other locals. The officers didn't know that she had not only changed her appearance, but also didn't have permission to leave the city. The police decided to go even higher into the mountains. Their persistence paid off. One girl they showed the pictures to recognized Paula. She described her as a strange woman in pink boots who returns home every evening across the bridge with a food package. The officers began to wait at the bridge, and the woman indeed appeared. She moved like a robot, not looking at anyone. The officers followed her. 40 minutes later, they went beyond the city limits and deeper into the forest. Finally, she entered a house where rooms were rented out. The police decided to rent a room in the house because otherwise they couldn't conduct surveillance. They were lucky. They got a room right next to Paula's. They could hear everything happening in the other room. They heard the voices of a man, Paula, and another girl. It turned out to be Mai. But Patricia or the children were not visible. The police did not take more decisive action because Stephen never left the room, not even to use the restroom, and they were not sure if it was him. Naturally, he didn't work. Paula and Mai did while the man lay in bed, and the officers were afraid that he simply wouldn't say where Patricia was. Suddenly, they overheard the man saying that tomorrow they would split up and leave one by one. Stephen planned to go even further to settlements of more wild indigenous tribes. Upon hearing this, the police officers called for backup to capture them. Knowing their schedule, they were able to apprehend group members one by one. Paula was stopped when she left for work early in the morning. Mai also left the house to do laundry. As for Stephen, when the police entered, he was lying on the bed as usual. The man resisted, introduced himself by another name, and pretended not to understand what was happening. To prevent him from stepping barefoot on the floor, pregnant Mai gave him her shoes. After that, he was forcibly removed from the hut. Fortunately, the girls immediately disclosed where Patricia was. By Stephen's command, Patricia and all the children remained in the hut as far away in the jungle as possible when Stephen, Mai, and Paula went to earn money, although Stephen, of course, didn't work. Patricia did everything around the house, took care of the children, and even worked on the plantation near the hut. She was there when the officers arrived. They called her by name. She had become so accustomed to the name Silvana that hearing Patricia felt unfamiliar. The officers believed they were rescuing Patricia and 4 children, but there were already 5. When Stephen, Paula, and Mai left for the city, Patricia begged not to be left alone, but Stephen was adamant, and predictably, at 8.5 months, she began having contractions. She screamed in agony. The children were with her but didn't know how to help her. At the girl's screams, a neighbor came. She was the one who assisted in the delivery. Patricia admits that she never thought she would give birth in the jungle at 19. The girl was extremely thin, looked exhausted when they rescued her, but even then she continued to think only about Stephen and the things he instilled in her. Meanwhile, Stephen was interrogated at the police station. An interesting fact emerged during the investigation. He was left alone with 2 colleagues briefly, and when they returned, one officer had already fallen under his influence. She claimed that Stephen was a prophet and they should help him, not arrest him. Immediately after Patricia, Mai, and Paula were rescued, they were separated as recommended by psychologists. They received assistance as victims of cults, sects, and dependent groups. It took them a long time before they started feeling better. They seemed to be in a lethargic state, but eventually, they woke up. The Aguilar family says that now everything that happened is in the past. They started anew, without accusations, without questions, without doubts. Patricia is still undergoing therapy and lives in her hometown with her parents and daughter. She received education in social rehabilitation and works in an organization that helps people with disabilities. Stephen was sentenced to 20 years in prison for human trafficking, sexual and labor exploitation. Many wondered how Patricia's parents didn't notice the changes in their daughter. Patricia was always a good student, but after her beloved uncle left her life, she started failing. Strangely enough, Stephen motivated her to study better, so they noticed changes in their daughter and They liked them. They thought she was coming to her senses. At that time, she was dating a boy from school whom her father didn't like. Alberto was happy when she dumped him. She stopped dressing in black, bought bright clothes, smiled more often, and asked to have a party for her 18th birthday. But her parents couldn't have known that all this was Stephen's demands. There were signs to pay attention to, but you never think that someone from another distant country will infiltrate your home through the internet and take away a family member. Dedication, obedience, detachment from the family happens very slowly, insidiously. It's in the cult's interest for their followers not to have loving and caring people around them. Everyone thinks that nothing like this will ever happen to them, but in moments of weakness, anyone can become vulnerable. Patricia Aguilar experienced firsthand what it's like to be isolated by a cult, taken out of her native country and taken away from her family. With her story, she wants to protect others from falling into the subtle mechanisms used by these false prophets. This case could have gone unnoticed by many, but became known thanks to Patricia's parents, who in their struggle to locate their daughter, managed to grab the attention of the media in different countries and share this story. On Tuesday, February 11, 1997, Le Portel, a small town on the southern coast of Boulogne-sur-Mer, was celebrating its carnival for 3 days. The festival was in full swing, and tonight was the last night that everyone was eagerly anticipating. The Merlin sisters, Peggy and Amelie, had never missed it. Today, they invited their friends Isabel and Audrey Raffin. The girls met 5 months ago. 16-year-old Amelie and 17-year-old Audrey became friends at school after the Raffin sisters moved to Le Portel. Soon they became inseparable, just like their older sisters, 20-year-old Peggy and Isabel. The girls spent the entire half of the day getting ready. Everything had to be perfect for the carnival evening. Finally, they were ready. Peggy transformed into a marquise, Amelie into Piero, Audrey chose a musketeer costume, and Isabel turned into an Indian. Their older sister Virginia joined Audrey and Isabel. At 8:30 p.m., the 5 girls left the house to walk to the square where the festival was taking place. Despite the cold and rain that evening, all 5 were in a great mood. The friends sang and danced together with everyone. People in carnival costumes gathered from all sides. Meeting their friends, they briefly stopped at a cafe to warm up. At 11:30 p.m., it was time to go down to the Partel beach to see the highlight of the show, the burning of Batista, a rag doll. This was the highlight that Peggy and Amelie wanted to show Audrey and Isabel. A huge bonfire had already been prepared on the beach. At midnight, the rag doll burned out, and as tradition requires, all carnival participants head to the village of Equien, located 3 kilometers to the south. 2 hours before that, the girls agreed to meet their friend Eve halfway and go together. But the young man never saw the girls. He decided that they had changed their minds and went to warm up at Peggy and Amelie's. In reality, there was no reason for Eve to worry since many people gathered at the carnival, and the townspeople in carnival costumes continued to walk back and forth between Partel and Equien. Morning came. The carnival was over and Peggy's and Amelie's mother came to the main square to pick them up. Marie-José Merlin bought croissants to have a snack with her daughters and listen to their stories about the evening, but they didn't show up at the meeting place. The woman returned home around 7:30 a.m., woke up Virginia and asked where the girls were and why they hadn't returned yet. Virginia replied that the carnival ends at 6 to 7 a.m. and they need more time to get back, or they might have stayed overnight at Isabel and Audrey's. Meanwhile, Isabel and Audrey's mother was also starting to get nervous. She had let her daughters go to the carnival and worried that they hadn't returned yet, but thought they had stayed overnight at Marie-José's. As time went on, and when the 2 mothers spoke on the phone, it turned out that neither of them had seen the girls. None of their friends or relatives knew where they were. Anxiety was growing. It was not like the girls to disappear like this. They always let their families know if they were going to be late. At 9 o'clock in the evening, driven mad with worry, the parents went to the police station. But to their deep disappointment, the police officers were not at all concerned. The girls were at an age when they could relax and forget about everything, especially during the carnival season. The police officers assumed that there was a carnival in the neighboring town and the girls went there to have fun. In other words, the girls' disappearance amounted to a simple escape. However, the parents knew for sure that they would not have run away in carnival costumes without money and documents. Moreover, they were very attached to their mothers. Marie-Jose Merlin had recently suffered a heart attack and the daughters were afraid to do anything that could upset their mother. Isabel and Audrey were also attached to their foster mother, Lola. The woman had adopted Audrey, Isabel, and their older sister Virginia after their mother's death when the girls were 3, 4, and 6 years old. The girls appreciated the love that surrounded them and would not have run away. Convinced that there was no point in running away and faced with the lack of reaction from the police, the relatives organized the search themselves. They began to post flyers around the city, searched the lighthouse, beaches, and abandoned bunkers built during World War II, and even inspected the abandoned tunnel of the city. The family even approached the boats moored at the pier and locked on them, assuming that the girls could be locked inside. In a cafe, they found a souvenir photo of Audrey in a musketeer costume, which confirmed that they were at the carnival. But for the next 48 hours, there was no other news about the girls. Then, thanks to flyers, calls from witnesses began to come to the Lamont family's home. People confirmed that they had seen the girls in Portel and remembered 4 outfits. But after the crowd headed to Equain, no one saw them. What is even more disturbing, witnesses reported a white van with white stripes, the passengers of which were staring at the walkers, following them, and generally behaving suspiciously. They also attracted increased attention because on that carnival evening, they were without costumes. This was a very interesting lead, but the police continued to adhere to the version of the escape. Families who were tired of hearing the same excuses decided to alert the press. Fortunately, journalists did not believe the escape version, and on Sunday, February 16th, an article appeared in the local newspaper. The journalist mentioned the van with green stripes. Reporters from all over the country picked up the story. Faced with pressure from the media, the prosecutor finally acknowledged that the escape may not be the only version of what happened. After 6 days of the girls' disappearance, the investigation started from scratch. The police quickly confirmed that a specific van was spotted on the night of the carnival and found witnesses, a family of 2, who reported the car's license plate number. At the same time, another call came into Laura's house. The woman reported that the wanted van was located in a neighboring village. According to the woman, it belonged to 2 scrap metal dealers who were well known in the village for their crimes. The woman added that they needed to hurry because the brothers were already repainting the van. With the license plate number, the police also identified the brothers as Jean-Michel and Jean-Louis Jordan. Could the brothers be the kidnappers of the 4 girls? It turned out that the brothers were long known to law enforcement. They grew up almost uneducated in completely unsuitable conditions for normal life. These people lived separately from society. According to rumors, their mother practiced incestuous relations with her sons, and their father was an aggressive alcoholic. 38-year-old Jean-Louis is the eldest in the family. He suffers from developmental abnormalities, was convicted of harassing girls, and spent 1.5 years behind bars. Barely released from prison, he received 10 years for violence against a girl but was released after 5. His brother Jean-Michel's criminal career is even more impressive. At 15, he attacked a 12-year-old girl so fiercely that he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, which is rare. After his release from prison, when his wife was preparing to become a mother, he killed his ex-girlfriend, 18-year-old Anita Dassonville. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison but was released after 9. Jean-Michel was married and had 3 children, one of whom, young Jennifer, died of meningitis. His second wife described him as a great husband and caring father, an opinion that was not shared by many. Those around him considered him a bundle of nerves with muscles. If young girls fell into the hands of the brothers, one should beware of the worst. The police had enough of this to interrogate the brothers. On Wednesday, a week after the girls' disappearance, the police carried out a large-scale operation to detain the Jordan brothers. And if they are the ones holding the girls, the slightest mistake could be fatal. Upon arrest, the brothers did not resist, but were surprised by the police's appearance. There were no girls in the house, although what the police saw there horrified them. The house resembled more of a dump, and there was a strong smell of filth. A little boy sat half-naked next to a German shepherd and was eating from a dog bowl. In total, there were 9 people living in the house, including 5 children under the age of 12. The police seized a van. It had been repainted, but what was even worse, the interior had been thoroughly clean. What are the brothers trying to hide? A race against time began for the investigators. They can only detain the brothers for up to 48 hours and need to make them talk, because right now they have suspicions, but absolutely no physical evidence. The brothers insisted in unison that they had not approached the carnival square. However, after the testimony of numerous witnesses was presented to them, they admitted to simply passing by but swore they had not crossed paths with any of the girls. By Friday morning, after the brothers had been in custody for 30 hours, time was running out for the investigators. So they decided to change tactics. The detective knew that the brothers had a younger sister who had disappeared long ago and was likely already dead. Jean-Louis was deeply attached to his sister and had been grieving her loss for a long time. The detective laid out photos of the missing girls and began telling the suspect about each one. He appealed to Jean-Louis' emotions, saying that they had families waiting for them. Although they couldn't save his sister, there was still a chance to help the girls and return them to their families. At these words, Jean-Louis leaned back in his chair, sighed, and declared that the girls were dead and that he was directly involved. He agreed to show where the bodies were buried. Journalists gathered outside the police station watched as the police car raced off in an unknown direction, and they followed. The entire procession stopped at the base of a dune. The police, together with Jean-Louis, went to the spot he had indicated. They had to dig for a very long time, so long that the detectives thought the man had deceived them and that there were no bodies there. Suddenly, a piece of red fabric from one of the musketeer costumes emerged. All 4 girls were lying in a pit measuring 1 by 2 meters. They were wearing carnival costumes that they had worn to the masquerade. On the other side of the dune, impatient journalists saw 4 hearses approaching. They arrived in silence. Then it became clear to them that the hearses were carrying the bodies of the 4 missing friends, and they rushed to report the news to the public. The families of the girls learned of the horrific news from the radio. The missing girls were found, but the nightmare was only beginning. On February 24th, forensic experts conducted an autopsy. They discovered that the perpetrators had chosen strangulation as their method of murder and had sexually assaulted 3 of the victims. Isabel became the first victim. She was severely beaten and then strangled. She likely put up the most resistance to her kidnappers. Peggy was sexually assaulted and then attempted to be strangled. However, she was buried alive. Sand was found in her esophagus, indicating that she was still breathing when she was buried. Amelie was even more beaten than the previous 2 girls. She was sexually assaulted and then killed. Finally, young Audrey was subjected to every kind of violence one can imagine. When Audrey was the last one alive, the perpetrators likely just played with her. Now the police wanted to know how it all happened. But during questioning, the brothers presented conflicting versions that only began the same way. Around 11 p.m., they met 4 girls dressed as musketeers, an Indian, a Marquise, and Piero, and agreed to give them a ride to Ikayan. They only had to drive 3 kilometers, and one of the girls quickly noticed that they had been driving too long and in the wrong direction. They yelled that they wanted to get out. One of the girls tried to open the van door, but it was blocked. According to Jean-Louis, Michel ordered him to calm down the captives, while he himself drove the van even faster. They arrived at Saint-Cecile Beach and brought the captives to an abandoned bunker. These are defensive structures that have survived in France since the war. The bunker has only one exit, which makes it an ideal prison for captives. And this is where the brothers' versions diverge. Jean-Louis said that he was guarding the girls in the blockhouse while Jean-Michel took them one by one. When his brother came for the last captive, Jean-Louis followed them to the top of the dune, where 3 girls were lying motionless on the ground. In his presence, Jean-Michel killed the 4th victim, and they buried the bodies together. Jean-Michel, in turn, admits that he led the victims to the blockhouse, but once inside, he left them in the company of his brother and went back for the keys, which he had left in the van. When he returned, his brother showed him 4 bodies lying on the top of the dune. They buried 2 of them. So, each of the brothers denies violence and murder. The most they did was to help bury the bodies. Without being able to rely on the suspects' statements, the detectives waited for evidence to prove the brothers' involvement in the murder. Forensic experts started with examining the van, which was an ideal trap. The lock on the back door was broken so that it could only be opened from the outside, and the van was cleaned out. However, upon closer inspection, investigators found a piece of her earring, a fragment of Audrey's earring that was torn off of her. This was evidence that the girls were brutally beaten inside the van. The problem was that besides the valuable evidence, the police did not find any DNA evidence of the brothers or the girls. They found some suspicious stains, possibly blood, but they were unable to conduct an analysis. Of course, the brothers cleaned it perfectly, but in 1999, the police did not have modern DNA analysis tools. Therefore, there was very little physical evidence to link the Jordan brothers to the crime. The DNA found on the victims' bodies did not allow for the exact identification of the perpetrator. Learning about this, Jean-Michel used this opportunity to retract his previous statements and deny any involvement in the crime. With minimal evidence and conflicting testimonies, the investigation could only rely on the reconstruction of the crime scene. Jean-Michel refused to cooperate, so the words of Jean-Louis were the only ones that could be verified. He showed the path that he, his brother, and the victims took towards the blackthorn bush. More accurately, they didn't walk, but rather crept because they first had to descend to the beach and then move along the boulders. It is important to remember that it rained on the night of the tragedy, and the tide reached almost to the blackthorn bush. Could 2 brothers lead 4 girls against their over wet and slippery stones in pitch darkness? But Jean-Louis insists that his brother then escorted each girl to the top of the dune. He describes the order in which his brother led the girls, of course not by name, but by their masquerade costumes. However, in the blackthorn bush, it was pitch dark, and the brothers had no flashlight. How could he have seen their costumes? Furthermore, the path he indicates is strewn with even greater obstacles. There is barbed wire on it, on which no piece of fabric was found, although the girls could not have crossed it without tearing their elaborate masquerade costumes. A careful examination of the girls' costumes did not reveal any tears or even snags. After this reconstruction, there were more questions than answers. The main ones being, under what circumstances were the girls killed, and how did the brothers divide the roles between themselves? The psychiatrist who talked to them described them as dangerous predators, especially Jean-Michel. Could either of them have remained hungry? Yet each of them insisted that at most, they helped the other bury the bodies. Now that the investigation is over, the jury will have to decide this dilemma. On October 16, 2002, the trial of the brothers began in St. Amma. During the trial, it became known that a few days before the carnival, the predators were already searching for prey. They almost kidnapped a young woman in Bermuda. She had been in a phone booth for 19 hours, and her friend was calling from another nearby booth. The girl noticed a van with green stripes that pulled up next to the payphone. The driver, whom she identified as Jean-Michel, stared at her intently when Jean-Louis appeared, ready to pull her inside by force. Luckily, her friend approached at that moment. Jean-Louis saw him, closed the door, and the van drove away. This was not the only similar story that the jurors heard, leading them to believe that the brothers had bought the van specifically for the purpose of kidnapping girls. However, Jean-Louis continued to claim that he had done nothing. It was like talking to a wall when trying to talk to his brother. The prosecutor was worried that the jurors would only accuse Jean-Michel, believing he had played a passive role. Jean-Louis, perhaps unintentionally, was playing a winning game. Therefore, the prosecutor requested that all participants in the trial be taken to the scene of the incident. Such a practice is very rare, but in this case, the prosecution considered it necessary to understand how events unfolded that night. On October 25, 2002, all court participants went to the beach of St. Cecile. As expected, the jurors could not even reach the Blackthorn, and you still need to climb to the top of the dune, overcoming a series of barbed wire. It is impossible to make such a journey at night without the victims tearing their clothes and trying to escape. Obviously, the girls were never in Blackthorn. This explains why, despite multiple signs of violence, there was no sand in their intimate areas. In other words, according to the results of the autopsy, the rape could not have occurred on the beach. The prosecutor is sure the violence and murder took place in the van in the presence of two brothers. They put the girls in the van, promising to take them to the beach. When Isabel realized that they were not going there, she panicked and tried to open the door, but in vain. Jean-Louis beat her fiercely to calm her down. In turn, Jean-Michel parked the van in a secluded corner of the campsite in the dunes, which is deserted at this time of year. The man turned off the engine and joined the girls and brother in the back of the van. The van was the instrument of the murder of the poor girls. It was there, in those horrific conditions, that they were beaten and killed. Peggy's DNA found under Amelie's fingernails provides additional heartbreaking details of the violence. While the girls were being abused, they held onto each other, seeking strength and support from their sister and friend. And then it's simple. You just need to open the door, walk 20 meters, and you'll find yourself at the top of the dune. What we don't know and will never know is what one did and what two did. The exact circumstances of the tragedy may be unclear, but the guilt of the two brothers is not in doubt, because the crime of one brother is so difficult to separate from the villainy of the other. As they prepared for the crime together and spread terror in the surrounding area together, the brothers were dubbed the Siamese Horror Brothers. On October 27, 2002, the verdict was announced. The brothers were sentenced to life imprisonment with maximum supervision for 22 years for Michel and 20 years for Louis. The slight difference is explained by the simple fact that without Louis' confession, the police would still be looking for the girls. To this day, the pain of the families is still very strong. Every year on February 12th, Marie Merlin and her son Gregory return to the beach of St. Cecile. It's the place where it all ended for them. Gregory says that today he should be a happy older brother, uncle. Instead, he mourns his sisters, kidnapped from the carnival on a night that was supposed to be one of the happiest days of their lives. In February 2003, the blockhouse that became a stumbling block in the case was blown up. The police protected the family from an angry mob, but a few days later, arson destroyed the Jordan family's home. In the morning of August 15, 1989, Wolfgang Silaf received a phone call in his office. Mom has disappeared. He heard through the tears in the voice of Yasmin, the 20-year-old daughter of his younger sister Bergit Meyer, who was 41 at the time. Wolfgang immediately understood that his sister couldn't have simply vanished and abandoned her daughter. Despite the fact that the girl was no longer a child, they had maintained a very close and trusting relationship with her mother. In 1989, Wolfgang was leading the criminal police department in Hamburg, however. Even such an influential person couldn't secure a thorough investigation into his sister's disappearance by the police in the city of Lüneburg, where Bergit lived. Firstly, the Lüneburg police were occupied with the investigation of two murders, to which they devoted all their resources. Secondly, Apart from their workload, there was another reason to approach this case somewhat carelessly. They had a suspect from the very beginning, Bergit's husband Harold Meyer. The man was a successful businessman working in the printing industry. He had started dating another woman after separating from his wife a few months before Bergit's disappearance. Bergit, who was unemployed at the time of their separation, struggled with the impending divorce and occasionally sought solace in alcohol. However, on the evening of August 14, 1989, Bergit greeted her husband with a smile. Harold came to discuss the terms of their separation, and it seemed that the woman had finally come to terms with her emotions. Bergit and Harold had a friendly discussion about the conditions of their divorce. Bergit was supposed to receive $500,000 Deutsche Marks and agreed to move out of the family home near Lüneburg. The next day, they had agreed to go to a notary. However, in the morning, Yasmin discovered her mother's disappearance. Bergit's Opel Cabriolet was parked in the garage, but there was no sign of the woman anywhere in the house. As it would later become known, her documents had also disappeared. Apart from a shoe print near Bergit's house, there were no slightest indications of a committed crime, no blood, no signs of struggle. According to Bergit's husband, the previous evening had gone smoothly, and they hadn't argued. After her husband left, Bergit had spoken on the phone with her mother and daughter and had mentioned that she and her husband didn't quarrel and that the meeting went well. However, despite Harold's statements, the police suspected that the husband had found another way to part with his wife and avoid paying her $500,000. Today, Harold Meyer continues to live in the same house from which his wife disappeared without a trace. He remembers Bergit as always being his loyal friend whom he could fully rely on. However, many believe Harold was guilty of his wife's disappearance and later her murder. He heard constant whispers and rumors. His friends questioned whether he had taken Bergit in his Porsche and dumped her into the sea from his motorboat. Even his own daughter sometimes had a silent question in her eyes, wondering if he knew something about her mother's whereabouts, and if the police could be right in their suspicions. Only Wolfgang Zilaf believed that Harold had nothing to do with his sister's disappearance because Harold and Bergit never argued about money. When Bergit met Harold that evening 32 years ago, elegantly dressed, he immediately noticed that she had had a few drinks to lift her spirits. He teased her, saying that she probably didn't plan on getting bored, and she flirtatiously replied, "Who knows?" Now he believes that her killer was nearby at that moment, already waiting for the opportune moment to attack her. However, it was only 6 weeks after Bergit's disappearance that Harold began to have suspicions about what might have happened that day. A colleague of his wife told him that on the day of Bergit's disappearance, she had cheerfully mentioned the neighbor's gardener in a conversation. Allegedly, he had knocked on Bergit's door, introduced himself, and asked for directions to a certain house, even though he already knew the address. Harold didn't know what to think. He remembered a party in the neighboring house where the gardener was also present. A quiet and silent man, blonde with very beautiful features but a terrifying gaze. Harold recalled how he had been extremely frightened by the cold and evaluative look in his icy eyes. And now it turned out that Bergit had met him a few months before her disappearance, right after that party at the neighbor's. She had been drinking excessively, and the gardener had escorted her home. Harold reported this new acquaintance of his wife to the police. The investigators found out that the gardener, who also worked at the cemetery, was named Kurt Werner Wichmann. He was handsome but an extremely dangerous type. In his early years, he had threatened a young mother and her child with a knife, and in his youth, he abducted a hitchhiking girl, subjected her to abuse, and nearly killed her. After that incident, he spent 5.5 years in prison. Kurt Werner Wichmann, the investigators, decided to personally talk to Wichmann and invited him to the police station. He showed up wearing gloves, claiming it was due to allergies. Wichmann stated that he had an alibi during the time of the woman's disappearance. After work, he spent the entire evening at home and only went for a walk with his German Shepherd after 10 p.m., but it didn't take him more than 15 minutes. His words were confirmed by his wife. Wisely, Wichmann decided not to mention that he had been on sick leave on the day of Bergit's disappearance and didn't need to go to work. It wouldn't have been difficult for the police to verify this, but surprisingly, Wichmann didn't seem worthy of attention as a suspect to any of the investigators. Wolfgang noted that at the very least, a preliminary investigation should have been initiated. However, this did not happen. The brother of the missing woman constantly heard from his colleagues that they were doing everything possible but unfortunately couldn't find her. When he tried to gather more information about the case, they fell silent. Days, months, and years passed before a new prosecutor in Lüneburg took up the case. It was only in 1993, 3.5 years after Bergit's disappearance, that a criminal case was filed against Kurt Werner Wichmann on suspicion of Birgit Meyer's murder. On a cold February morning in 1993, the police knocked on the door of a brick house on the outskirts of Lüneburg, Kurt Werner Wichmann's home. His wife opened the door, but her husband was not at home. The police presented a search warrant and began their work. The search immediately led the officers to a recently demolished wall made of plasterboard in the basement. On the first floor, they noticed a soundproof door. Kurt's wife explained that she didn't have a key. It was only in possession of her husband and his brother. The officers forced open the door, behind which awaited a veritable arsenal: 2 small caliber rifles, a revolver, silencers, ammunition, stun guns, knives, sedatives, chains, ropes, and handcuffs with traces of blood. The police confiscated all these items. During the search of the surrounding area, a metal detector was triggered. With the help of a police excavator, they managed to dig up something extraordinary in Wichmann's garden: an entire car, a brand new bright red Ford sports coupe, on the back seat of which forensic experts found blood. The search team also detected a strong smell of decomposing flesh inside the car, but no actual body was found. Shortly thereafter, the police found a parked VW Golf near Lüneburg registered to Wichmann. Inside the car, they discovered road maps, a sleeping bag, a thermos, and binoculars. The equipment seemed more suitable for a hunter or someone who spends a lot of time spying on people they intend to kill. For several weeks, Kurt managed to evade the authorities. However, on April 15, 1993, an accident occurred on a country road near Heilbronn. The police inspected the car, which contained 2 men. Weapons were found in the car, so the driver was taken to the station. It was discovered that the driver was Kurt, and his younger brother was sitting next to him in the car. The police did not believe that Kurt could pose a danger to himself, so they did not confiscate his belt. The man died in his prison cell on April 25, 1993, at the age of 43. The police quickly closed the case because, according to the German Code of Criminal Procedure, the deceased should not become the subject of an investigation. However, this was far from the end of the story. Rather, it was the beginning of an investigation that would lead to the uncovering of the most horrifying crimes in the country's criminal history. In 2002, Wolfgang retired and was able to dedicate more attention and time to his sister's case. He gained access to the case files and was shocked. To his horror, he discovered that all the evidence had been destroyed, including the red Ford that was unearthed, and the basement in Kurt's house, where the search team had sensed the presence of remains, had never been thoroughly investigated. However, in Wolfgang's opinion, the evidence should have been preserved. Firstly, because there is no statute of limitations on murder cases. Secondly, the principle of not conducting an investigation against the dead is not applicable in this case because there is another suspect, Birgit Harold, the husband of Birgit Meyer. To justify or condemn Harold, all the evidence needed to be examined, the neighbors of Kurt needed to be interrogated. In short, regular police work needed to be done. But now, it was impossible to study the evidence. Nevertheless, Wolfgang decided not to give up and assembled a group of volunteers from his former colleagues. They discussed the motives, possible developments, and the behavior of the perpetrator again and again. Finally, They came up with the idea that Bergit's disappearance might be connected to other unsolved crimes. In search of confirmation of this theory, Wolfgang went to Wyman's house. The secret room had hardly changed since it was discovered in 1993. In the room, he found video recordings of 2 TV shows, one about Bergit Meyer's disappearance and the other about the murders in Gode. Wolfgang immediately informed the police in Lüneburg, and nothing happened. The cases remained unsolved for years. In 2015, the head of the criminal police department in Lüneburg was replaced. Wolfgang managed to convince him to create a commission to review his sister's case. The commission was led by an experienced and meticulous specialist, Richard Kaufmann, who had solved all his cases over the past few years. He discovered that a tiny drop of blood was found on the handcuffs found in Wyman's secret room, and the sample had not been destroyed because it was stored at the Hanover Medical School laboratory. DNA comparison showed that the blood belonged to Bergit Meyer. Now, there was no doubt that Wyman had handcuffed Bergit and probably killed her. The investigators speculated that he wanted to kidnap her and demand a ransom from Harold, but something went wrong. It was evident that at least 2 people were involved in the abduction because a neighbor heard the sound of a running car engine that night. Where could Bergit's body have been? The investigator examined several graves dug in the cemetery when Wyman worked there, but Bergit Meyer was not found in them. Then Wolfgang decided to find out everything he could about the man's past. First of all, one should not imagine a spoiled boy from a wonderful family. His father used to threaten his mother with an axe and was cruel to his sons. Young Kurt Werner Wyman ended up in a social institution called Witchenstift, and after the New Year holidays in 1964, he didn't want to go back. But he needed money to escape, so the 14-year-old boy entered the apartment of his parents' tenants, a young family, with a dagger and a flashlight. The husband was at work, and only the mother and the infant were at home. The woman woke up because of the flashlight's light, screamed, and the boy lightly choked her to prevent her from screaming. Then he turned to the child, and the woman was about to believe that he would do something to her son, but fortunately, he changed his mind. Unfortunately, the girl whom 22-year-old Kirk decided to give a ride to in 1970 was not so lucky. Offering a hitchhiking girl to get in his car, he took her to the forest and attacked her. After getting what he wanted, he choked the poor girl a little and threw her in the trunk, apparently planning to bury her. However, something incredible happened. When he opened the trunk again, the girl, who had regained consciousness, managed to convince the man to let her go, pretending that he shouldn't be afraid of her. But when he read an article about the attack in the newspaper 2 days later, he realized that the events described in it were not as he perceived them. And what did he do?
He went to the police to, as he claimed, correct some facts. After adjusting the facts, the man spent 5.5 years in prison. People who knew Kirk describe him as an arrogant loner. He didn't need friends, but he had a strong need for recognition, so he was a braggart from childhood and loved things, especially cars, that he couldn't afford. Realizing what kind of person Kurt was, Wolfgang understood that he was obsessed with control. He was a narcissist for whom it was important how he appeared in the eyes of others. The desire to control his external image was so great that he was even willing to turn himself in after committing a crime. Therefore, Wolfgang assumed that his sister Bergit Meyer's body was hidden in Wyman's house or on the premises of his house. It's sad that when he asked the police in Lüneburg to conduct a thorough search there a few years ago, they didn't listen to him. As the head of the investigation group told him, his criminal experience told him that Bergit wasn't there. While he was saying this, he was standing right above her body, with only a concrete slab separating them. When Wolfgang finally opened the concrete floor in Kurt's garage many years later, he found what was left of his sister's body. The autopsy showed that Bergit Meyer was shot in the head, just like at least one of the victims of the Horde murders and another victim of the 1968 murder. The Bergit case was solved, but Wolfgang decided not to stop there,
remembering other families waiting for the crimes that affected their loved ones to be solved. Thus, thanks to Wolfgang's persistence, a crime that had terrified the entire northern part of Germany in the 90s was finally solved at the end of 2017, the murders in Gord. Gord is the vast wooded area east of Lüneburg. In July 1989, the weather in northern Germany was sunny and hot, prompting many people to seek refuge from the summer heat in the cool shade of the forest. On July 12, 1989, 2 days before Bergit's disappearance, 3 people who were picking blueberries in Gord suddenly smelled a nauseating sweet odor. Trying to find the source of the smell, they discovered a human hand under a pine tree among the branches. It turned out that on May 21, 1989, a married couple from Hamburg, 51-year-old Peter and 45-year-old Ursula Reinhold, went on a picnic in the forest, intending to spend a pleasant time in the fresh air. They were brutally murdered, and their bodies were dragged away from the scene of the attack. When they were discovered, the husband and wife were almost naked, but it was unclear whether the perpetrator had undressed them or if they had undressed themselves before the attack. The killer took their picnic basket, binoculars, and the keys to their car, which he used to escape. The car was later found in another city. The disappearance of the couple was reported, but they could not be found for 7 weeks. Due to the heat, very little remained of their bodies, making it impossible to determine the cause of death. However, robbery was ruled out as the motive because valuable items were still found on the victims. Since there were no mobile phones at the time, the people picking berries hurried to the forest ranger to inform him of the horrifying discovery so that he could report it to the police. However, it was not just the bodies themselves that terrified the Germans, who nicknamed Gord the Dead Forest. The unique fact in modern criminal history in Germany was that while the police were still examining Peter and Ursula's bodies, the killer claimed the lives of another couple located just 800 meters away from the investigators. On July 12, 1989, Ingrid Warmbier, 46, and Bernd Michael Kopping, 43, from Hanover, arrived in Gord. They were spouses but not with each other, which is why they chose this forest. After parking their car, they walked about 2 kilometers into the forest. They were brutally killed, sound of a gunshot, and then the killer took their Polaroid camera and the keys to their car, with which he fled. It was later determined that he drove the car for about a week before abandoning it. The bodies were discovered by chance only 2 weeks later when the police were searching the area due to the first 2 murders. The crime scenes were only 800 meters apart, but subsequent tests showed that the police working on the first murder could not hear the gunshots due to the locations of the crime scenes in the depressions. Given the new discovery, the random encounter of the berry pickers became of great importance. As they hurried to the forest ranger to report the horrifying find, they encountered a man. Of course, 2 weeks later, their description of the person would be quite vague. But they remembered that they had encountered a tall and strong 40-year-old brunette with medium-length hair, without glasses or a beard. He was carrying a bag that was clearly not empty. Based on the witnesses' accounts, a composite sketch was created even if this man might not have had any connection to the crime. The common factor in these murders was that they were committed in the same area of a vast forest. Additionally, the victims were both of middle age. In 2 cases, the perpetrator stole the victims' belongings, although it was not a typical robbery. He would leave the crime scenes in the victims' cars and then abandon the vehicles in small towns with railway connections. Both towns were located along the Hanover-Hamburg route, and these parallels led investigators to speculate that the same person was responsible for the crimes. In 1989, Kurt Werner Weimann was 40 years old and lived 30 kilometers away from Gord. On the day of the secret lover's murder, he was on sick leave. The spouses were also killed on a Sunday when Kurt didn't have to go to work. However, the investigators initially found no evidence linking Weimann to the crimes in Gord. Furthermore, he did not resemble the composite sketch. Therefore, the police focused on other suspects, Suspecting that the deceived husband of the second victim had hired a professional to deal with his unfaithful wife and her lover but accidentally targeted the wrong person before carrying out the hit. Once again, Wolfgang couldn't understand the investigators' decision. He and his group of colleagues immediately suspected that Kurt matched the profile of the gored killer. The brutality of the crimes and the intimate aspects, as evidenced by the victim's exposed clothing, all aligned with Weiman's profile. Moreover, years ago, Wolfgang found a videotape of the TV program Aktenzeichen Sei, which covered the gored murders, in Kurt's secret room. Being a narcissist, Kurt also collected video recordings and newspaper clippings about Bergit Meyer. There were also pieces of evidence showing that the man sought information about Bernd Michael Kopping, who was killed in Gord. However, as often happens today, the DNA analysis provided the final piece of evidence. The Gord killer had a habit of driving the victims' cars for several days. In one of the vehicles, 3 hairs and possibly other biological materials were found. However, it took nearly 30 years before the DNA in the car was compared to Kurt's DNA. Only at the end of 2017 did the analysis yield a match. Kurt Werner Weimann was the perpetrator of the 2 murders in Gord. Lola Luna Chomnales was born on November 4, 1999, in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She grew up in the family of Adriana Belmonte and Diego Chomnales, the son of the renowned chef Beatriz Chomnales. In November 2014, when the girl turned 15, her parents decided to gift her a trip to New York for the Christmas holidays. However, before that, they sent their daughter to spend a few days relaxing with her godmother's family in Rocha, Uruguay. On December 27th, Lola arrived in Uruguay, where she was greeted by her godmother, Claudia Fernandez. The girl was clearly in a great mood, which was captured in a photo taken by Claudia. Claudia, her husband Hernan Tuzinkiewicz, and their 2 children were happy about Lola's arrival. They had planned to spend these few days together, sunbathing on Barra de Velizes beach, swimming in the sea, and relaxing. That same evening, Lola, Hernan, and his 14-year-old stepson visited a drum festival taking place in the city center. Hernan and the boy didn't leave Lola's side in the crowd, but at some point, the boy moved away from them because he was bored. Nevertheless, after the festival, they all returned home together. The next day, the family went to the beach. Around 3 p.m., Lola asked her godmother for permission to take a walk along the beach. She wanted to walk to the spa resort of Aguas Dulces along a fairly popular trail that allowed her to explore the flora and fauna of the area. Since the route was considered popular and safe for walks, and the locals were known for their friendliness, Claudia had no objections. She told Lola what time they would be waiting for her at home and watched as she calmly walked away from them along the beach. Lola was wearing a bikini and denim shorts. She carried a backpack containing a sarong, a book, her identification, a water bottle, and a towel. She didn't have her phone with her. Obviously, there was poor reception on the beach. The backpack also contained a wallet with 2,000 Uruguayan pesos. Several hours passed, it got dark, and Lola still hadn't returned. Her godmother became worried. The family walked along the route that Lola had planned to take, but she was nowhere to be found. In the evening, Claudia called Lola's parents to explain what had happened. She told Adriana that she had already contacted the police. However, it took another 45 minutes before they arrived at the station and reported the teenager's disappearance. The police began the search for Lola. Since she disappeared during a walk on the beach, it was thoroughly searched both lengthwise and crosswise. Helicopters and search dogs were brought in to assist in the search. Lola's parents immediately arrived in Uruguay to help the police. Almost simultaneously with the start of the investigation, it became known that Adriana and Diego were receiving anonymous calls. The caller did not ask for a ransom or make any demands. They simply stated that Lola was with them and that she was fine. Unfortunately, this turned out to be untrue. 2 days later, on December 30th, her body was found partially covered in sand on the beach. She was in an area with many dunes and dense vegetation. There were shallow knife cuts on her neck and signs of blows on her head. The autopsy revealed that Lola was attacked from behind, then dragged or forced to the location where she was found. The killer pressed her face into the sand for a prolonged period until she suffocated. This was determined by the presence of sand in her lungs. After the news of the crime became known, there was an unprecedented uproar in the press of Argentina and Uruguay. As often happens in such cases, journalists began to put forward theories about what could have happened. The suspicions of the Uruguayan police and the media immediately fell on the family of Lola's godmother, especially on Hernan, and there were several reasons for that. Firstly, they claimed to Adriana and Diego that they had already contacted the police, although they actually delayed before going to the station. Secondly, the media tried to see something sinister in the fact that Lola, Hernan, and his 14-year-old stepson went to a drum festival together, but at some point, the boys separated from them, leaving the girl with Hernan. A hypothesis related to violence against Lola emerged, but the forensic expert found no evidence to support this. However, there were other reasons to suspect them. Claudia and Hernan immediately hired a lawyer, and not a single family member agreed to take a polygraph test. Lola's parents added fuel to the fire by making a series of bold statements. In particular, Diego stated that he had long ceased to trust Hernan, which provoked further questions. If he didn't trust the man, why did he allow his daughter to go on vacation with them? It is important to note that Claudia and Adriana had been friends for 25 years. Hernan was Claudia's second husband, and Lola's parents had known him for about 5 years. They all originally lived in Argentina, but Hernan and Claudia moved to Uruguay. When Hernan was interrogated, the investigators noted contradictory statements, which led to his arrest on December 31st. Claudia was arrested on suspicion of concealing evidence. Her son was also detained because he was suspected of making those anonymous calls. It is not confirmed with certainty that he was the one who called Adriana and Diego, but it is evident that those calls were a failed attempt at a joke. Nevertheless, the police interrogated all 3 family members for several days, but there was no evidence against them. The investigators explained that they found some discrepancies in their testimonies, but they were insignificant. Hernan claimed they returned home at 11 o'clock, while his son said it was 12. Besides that, the police had nothing to charge Hernan, Claudia, or her son with. Therefore, on January 2, 2015, they were all released. Apparently, after various public statements, the relationship between the friends suffered. Claudia and her loved ones never spoke to Lola's parents again, nor did they pick up the phone to offer condolences. Adriana believes that their lawyer may have given them such advice. However, she believes that as friends, a simple human gesture would have been to call and express condolences, especially considering their 25 years of friendship. A few days after the discovery of the body, Lola's pink backpack was found. It was also buried in the sand about 200 meters from where Lola's body was found. This immediately raised a lot of questions. How did the police initially not find the body and now the backpack, despite thoroughly searching the entire beach and its surroundings multiple times? Additionally, the authorities in the town had claimed from the beginning that the beach was a very safe area. But it was at least strange because drug dealers operated there, especially in the area where the body was found. Nonetheless, almost all of the girl's belongings remained in the backpack, except for 2,000 pesos that the perpetrator took from her wallet. Furthermore, the towel and documents had bloodstains on them. Forensic experts examined these items and found Lola's DNA on them, but it was mixed with male DNA. Since suspicions had not been completely lifted from Hernan, his DNA was compared to the one found. They checked it against the Uruguayan police database, but there were no matches there either. After the discovery of the backpack, one suspect caused a big stir. He was suspected based on witness testimonies regarding his whereabouts on the day of the murder. According to local residents, a man nicknamed El Conejo, the Rabbit, was working on a roof near the beach at the time the girl went for a walk. In the middle of the day, the man went for lunch, and his colleagues knew that he didn't have any money with him. However, he returned with food and cash. This immediately raised the question of where he got the food if he didn't buy it. But that's not all. Someone even claimed to have seen him with a pink backpack on the day of Lola's disappearance. One newspaper wrote that he confessed to the murder, and other media outlets picked up the news. However, it turned out to be untrue. The man provided an explanation of where he got the food. Although the police suspected that he had actually stolen it from beachgoers, there was no evidence connecting him to Lola's case. He never confessed to anything, and after his release, he filed a lawsuit against the newspapers that spread unverified news. At this point, the investigation significantly stalled. The main suspects had already been released, and the investigators had no leads to pursue. At first glance, it seemed that the girl didn't know anyone in the town, but she had managed to attend a drum festival in the city center, and being sociable and open, she freely interacted with people. Therefore, the police had to investigate this lead. They detained and interrogated about 40 people, mainly vendors and dealers from the beach, but they were all eventually released. The situation was further aggravated by the constant changes in prosecutors and judges, and whenever a new prosecutor was appointed, they would review the case from scratch. This significantly hindered the investigation. But on February 18, 2015, there seemed to be some progress in the case. An anonymous call was made to the police. The caller stated that Angel Moreira, also known as El Cachila or Keisha, was involved in the crime. The police arrested and interrogated the man. He worked on the beach, parking cars. Angel explained that he met Lola when she was walking along the beach. He approached her to offer some souvenir trinkets for sale. They exchanged a few sentences about where the girl came from when Lola mentioned feeling dizzy. Angel suggested that they go to a shady area. He took her to a place where tall bushes and dunes provided some shade and coolness. There, the girl fell to her knees. Angel tried to check her pulse, but not hearing it, he got scared and ran away. The statement sounded extremely strange, but without evidence, the police had to release him. 4 years passed when the new prosecutor in Jorge Bay's case reviewed the materials and decided to interrogate Angel again. After the interrogation on May 22, 2019, the man was arrested. This time he was charged with obstruction of justice. His DNA did not match the DNA on Lola's towel and documents, so the prosecutor concluded that he was covering up the person who was truly guilty of the crime. Bass explained that in Angel's statements made in 2015, he revealed details that only someone who was with Lola at the time of the murder could have known. He knew that Lola fell to her knees on the sand, and a forensic expert confirmed this. However, Lola didn't fall because she suddenly felt dizzy, but because she had received shallow knife wounds. Despite Angel's arrest, the Chommiles family still awaited an answer to the main question for several more years. Until geneticist Natalia Sandberg became interested in the case, 7 years after the murder, the case took a decisive turn. And how the investigators found the suspect resembles a plot from a detective novel. It occurred to Natalia Sandberg to trace the genetic DNA trace of an unknown man found on Lola's towel and documents. There were no matches on the paternal line, but the examination of the maternal line revealed a small match with a prisoner serving time for murder. In other words, the man who left his blood on Lola's towel is related to the man currently serving a sentence. The third crime, in which the victims were Marines who died in the naval complex on Cerro de Montevideo, was the tip of the iceberg that allowed investigators to reach the true killer of Lola Chommiles. The murders took place on Sunday morning, May 31, 2020. Juan Manuel Escobar, Alex Galinia, and Alan Rodriguez were found shot in the head. The police established that the killer is Jonathan Brand Gundy. Jonathan was born in Rocha. When the police found his mother and examined her DNA, it became clear that they were looking for another son of the woman, Jonathan's half-brother. The woman told the investigators that she had given birth to 11 children from different fathers, including 8 boys. But only one son was given up for adoption when he was 18 days old. It turned out that he was the one the police had been searching for 7 years. Their new suspect was named Leonardo Senar. In 2014, during Lola's murder, Senar was homeless, spending his days and nights between La Paloma, Chuy, and Castillos. He lived in these places through odd jobs. But recently, he settled in the city of Chuy, lived with a girlfriend, and worked in a bakery. The man had a history of police records from 2003 to 2009 for aggression, theft, and violence. Despite his run-ins with the law, his DNA was not stored in the database because the database itself was created after 2012. Therefore, on May 18, 2022, the police obtained a search warrant for his house. They anticipated that the man would refuse to provide his DNA, and they were right. However, forensic experts examined the man's toothbrush and comb. To the surprise and joy of the forensic experts, the DNA match was 99.9%, confirming it was his DNA. On May 19th, the suspect was arrested at the border with Brazil. During the interrogation, Leonardo claimed that he had no connection to the crime. As for his DNA found on the identification card and the girl's towel, he explained that he found a pink backpack on the beach. When he looked inside, he saw a wallet with 2,000 pesos and stole the money. Regarding the blood, he said that a few hours before, he cut himself with a bottle shard at work, and when he reached into the backpack, the bandage fell off and the cut started bleeding. Therefore, he wiped his hand with Lola's towel. However, there were several inconsistencies in his version. Firstly, his blood was not simply found on the girl's belongings, it was mixed with her blood. This couldn't have happened if he found the backpack and just took out the wallet. Secondly, according to his own words, someone else, not Leonardo, took Lola's backpack on the 28th, the day of the murder, after Leonardo stole the money and inexplicably buried it 4 kilometers away from where it was found, without taking anything from it. Even the suspect couldn't deny the absurdity of this story. Finally, his colleagues who worked with him in December 2014 didn't recall the incident with a broken bottle and Leonardo's cut. Moreover, according to documentation, Leonardo was no longer employed at the brewery on the day of the crime. Here is what the police believe actually happened. In the middle of the day on December 28, 2014, when Lola went for a walk on the beach, she was intercepted by Leonardo and Angel. They dragged her into an area with dunes and bushes. There, Lola tried to escape, and the kidnappers struck her several times on the head and stabbed her in the neck, causing her to fall to her knees. However, these wounds were not fatal, and Lola continued to resist. It is likely that she also screamed loudly, trying to attract the attention of other vacationers or beach vendors. In an attempt to silence Lola, they pressed her face into the sand. They pressed for too long, causing Lola to suffocate. The police believe that the motive for the crime was violence, although the assailants were unable to carry out their intended act and ended up killing her because they did not expect such fierce resistance from the teenage girl. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that Leonardo was previously tried for a case very similar to Lola's. That case occurred in 2009 when Leonardo was 26 years old. The victim was a 15-year-old girl, just like Lola. Leonardo followed her for several blocks before attacking her with a knife. He dragged the victim to a remote wooded area where he assaulted her. The Uruguayan police are convinced that at least 2 people were involved in the attack on Lola. Therefore, they charged Leonardo with aggravated murder and Angel with harboring a criminal. Jorge Base demanded a sentence of 10 years of imprisonment for Angel and 15 to 30 years for Leonardo. In June 2021, Angel, who had been in prison since 2019, was released by a judge's decision granting him conditional early release under oath. Despite psychiatric and psychological evaluations characterizing Angel as an aggressive and impulsive individual lacking impulse control, the judge found no grounds to accuse him of harboring a criminal, as harboring entails assisting the criminal after the crime has been committed. In this case, Angel should have been charged as an accomplice. Therefore, according to the judge, Angel Moreira's actions do not fall under the category of harboring. However, the prosecutor filed an appeal against the judge's decision, stating that Angel was present before, during, and after the crime. Despite their initial suspicions, Lola's parents, Adriana and Diego, trust the evidence presented by the police, agree that two suspects were involved in the crime, and hope for a swift verdict.